Welcome, listeners, to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we begin a story of cunning, time, and the audacity of a man who dared to challenge the inevitable. This is the story of the man who outsmarted death. Arthur Pendleton was a man of time, not in the sense of a historian or a physicist, but in a way far more intimate and tangible. His world was one of gears and springs, of pendulums swinging in hypnotic rhythm, and the soft, constant heartbeat of 1,000 clocks. His shop, Pendleton's Fine Horology, was a small, dusty sanctuary tucked away on a quiet street in Providence, Rhode Island. For 50 years, it had been his kingdom, a place where time itself could be paused, dissected, and repaired. The air inside always carried the faint, metallic scent of aged brass and cleaning oil, a perfume Arthur inhaled more deeply than the city air outside. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grimy front window, cutting through the dusty air in thick, golden shafts that illuminated the intricate faces of grandfather clocks standing like silent sentinels along the walls. The only sound was the gentle, unsynchronized symphony of 100 tiny heartbeats. Tick, tock, tick, a sound that was as comforting to Arthur as his own breath. At 74, Arthur moved with the slow, deliberate grace of the mechanisms he so loved. His hands, though wrinkled and mapped with the veins of old age, were impossibly steady. He could coax the smallest screw into place, or adjust a hairspring with a surgeon's precision. His eyes, magnified by a jeweler's loupe that seemed a permanent fixture on his forehead, saw a universe in the face of a pocket watch. He wasn't just a repairman, he was a master craftsman, one of the last of his kind. He understood that a clock wasn't just a machine for telling time, it was a vessel for it. Each one held stories, of anniversaries, of last moments, of generations past. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, as a crisp autumn wind rustled the dying leaves outside, something unusual happened. The gentle symphony in his shop fell silent. Not one by one, but all at once. The deep chime of the grandfather clock, the frantic ticking of the mantelpieces, the delicate pulse of the wristwatches under glass, everything stopped. The silence that descended was profound, unnatural, and heavier than any sound he had ever heard. It was a dead silence. Arthur slowly looked up from the delicate omega he was working on, his own heart suddenly pounding in the quiet void. He slid the loupe from his eye and scanned the room. Every pendulum was still. Every second hand was frozen. It was impossible. A power outage wouldn't do this. Many of his clocks were purely mechanical, wound by hand, their life force coiled in a metal spring, independent of the city's electrical grid. Then, the small bell above the door chimed, a sound so jarring in the stillness that it made him flinch. A man stood in the doorway, closing the door softly behind him. He was unremarkable in every way. He wore a simple, well-tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His face was neither old nor young, his features plain and forgettable. He had the bland, patient air of a government clerk or an insurance adjuster. There was nothing about him that should have been frightening, yet a cold dread, heavy and numbing, began to seep into Arthur's bones. The man walked forward, his footsteps making no sound on the old wooden floorboards. He stopped before the main counter, his gaze sweeping across the frozen, silent clocks with a look of detached interest. "A fascinating collection," the man said. His voice was calm, neutral, without any discernible accent. Each one a small monument to a finite journey. Arthur cleared his throat, his own voice sounding rough in the stillness. "Can I help you? The shop is having some technical difficulties at the moment." The man smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that didn't reach his placid eyes. "I assure you, Mr. Pendleton, everything is working exactly as it should be. The difficulties are not with the shop." He paused, his gaze finally settling on Arthur. "They are with you." Arthur felt the coldness spread from his chest to his limbs. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was no ordinary customer. This was not a man who had come to have a watch repaired. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am an appointment you have known about your entire life, but have conveniently chosen to forget," the man replied smoothly. "I am the final entry in your ledger, the last tick of the clock. You have a schedule to keep, Arthur." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the serene authority of a law of nature, like gravity or the rising of the sun. This was it. The moment every ticking clock in his shop had been counting down to. His moment. Most people, faced with this visitor, would react with fear, denial, or bargaining. They would weep, or scream, or beg for more time. Arthur Pendleton did none of those things. He was a man who had spent his life understanding systems, rules, and meticulous order. And this, he understood, was the ultimate system, the final rule. But in every system, he had always found a loophole, a gear that could be adjusted, a spring that could be tightened to alter the outcome. He looked at the strange, calm man before him, and then his eyes drifted to the corner of his workshop, to a project that had consumed the last decade of his life. It was his masterpiece, an object of impossible complexity that no one else had ever seen. He took a slow, steadying breath, his watchmaker's mind, a mind trained for precision and intricate problems, clicking into gear. Fear was a useless emotion. What he needed was a plan. "I see," Arthur said, his voice regaining its strength. He slowly stood up, his joints protesting. "You've come for me." "I have," the visitor confirmed. "It is time." "Time," Arthur mused, a faint glint appearing in his old eyes. "Yes, I know a thing or two about time. It is a peculiar thing. It can be measured, but can it be negotiated?" The visitor raised a single, curious eyebrow. "That is not within my purview. The schedule is absolute." "All schedules can be adjusted," Arthur countered, a newfound confidence in his tone. He gestured towards his workbench. "I am a craftsman. I pride myself on my work. But I believe in professional courtesy. You are a professional, are you not? At the very end of your assignment." "One could say that." "Then, as one professional to another, I propose a wager," Arthur said, his heart now beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. "A game of skill. My craft against your function." For the first time, a flicker of genuine interest appeared in the visitor's impassive eyes. He looked around the silent shop again, as if seeing it for the first time. "A game? Mr. Pendleton, I do not play games." "Everyone plays games," Arthur replied, a wry smile touching his lips. "This one is simple. I have created a device, a clock unlike any other in this room, in the world. It is my life's work. If you can solve its puzzle before the sand in this old hourglass runs out," he pointed to a 3-minute timer on his desk, "then I will go with you, without another word. Quietly. Willingly." The visitor was silent, his gaze fixed on Arthur. The proposition hung in the dead air, an audacious, impossible challenge. "And if I cannot?" the visitor finally asked, his voice laced with the faintest hint of curiosity. Arthur Pendleton smiled, the smile of a master watchmaker who knows every secret of the machine he has built. "Then you will leave," he said. "And you will not return for me for 100 years." The silence in the shop stretched, taut and thin. The visitor, the entity who called himself an appointment, regarded Arthur with an unervingly placid expression. For a being of immense, timeless power, the concept of a wager seemed to be a novelty, like a child discovering a curious insect. There was no anger, no indignation, only a deep, ancient curiosity. 100 years was, to him, less than the blink of an eye. But the challenge to his absolute authority, posed by a fragile mortal, was apparently too intriguing to dismiss. 100 years, the visitor repeated, his voice a flat, toneless echo in the dead air. "You place a high value on your craft, Mr. Pendleton, and on your time." "It's the only thing I truly own," Arthur replied, his gaze unwavering. "And I have poured all of it into my work. Into this." With a slow, deliberate movement, Arthur walked to the far corner of his workshop, to a heavy oak pedestal covered by a worn velvet cloth. His hands, steady as they had ever been, took hold of the cloth. The visitor watched, his charcoal suit seeming to drink the dim light around him, his presence a void in the cluttered shop. Arthur pulled the cloth away. The object beneath was not a clock in any recognizable sense. It was a sphere, about the size of a human head, crafted from a dizzying array of interlocking rings and gears made of silver, gold, and a burnished, blue-black steel. It rested on a simple brass stand, but the device itself was anything but simple. There were no hands, no numbers, no dial. Instead, its surface was a complex, three-dimensional maze. Tiny, intricate symbols, reminiscent of forgotten alphabets and astronomical charts, were etched into the metal rings. As the faint light from the window touched it, the sphere seemed to come alive, with a soft, internal luminescence that pulsed gently from deep within its core. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. "This," Arthur said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and reverence, "is the Chronos Labyrinth. My life's work." The visitor stepped closer, his soundless feet bringing him to the edge of the workbench. He studied the device, his head tilted slightly. "It does not tell time." "No," Arthur agreed. "It contains it. Or rather, it contains the idea of time. It's not a linear machine. It operates on memory, paradox, and choice. The rings can be turned, the gears can be shifted. There are trillions of possible combinations. But only one path leads to the center." "And what is at the center?" the visitor asked, his gaze still locked on the intricate sphere. "Stillness," Arthur said simply. "At the very heart of this machine of constant potential motion, there is a single, solitary gear that does not move. It is the anchor, the prime gear. To solve the labyrinth, you must manipulate the outer rings to clear a path and touch that motionless gear. That is the objective. The visitor extended a hand, but did not touch the sphere. He seemed to be sensing it, reading its impossible geometry. You believe a puzzle of your own creation can confound me? I believe it is a fair test, Arthur countered. He reached for the small, 3-minute hourglass on his desk. The sand within it was a fine, silvery dust. My entire life's knowledge of mechanics and the nature of time is contained within that sphere. You have your principles. It has mine. We shall see which are more resilient. Without another word, Arthur placed the hourglass next to the Chronos labyrinth. He looked at the visitor, whose calm expression was the only thing in the universe that seemed truly still. He received a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur took a deep breath and turned the hourglass over. The first silvery grains began to fall. The game begins. The visitor raised his hand and gently touched the outer golden ring of the labyrinth. The moment his fingers made contact, the sphere responded. The internal light brightened, and the rings began to rotate with a soft, frictionless hum. He turned the first ring, and a series of smaller, inner rings shifted in response. He was methodical, his movements precise and economical. He was not trying to force a solution. He was simply learning the system, understanding its rules. For the first minute, he made what appeared to be incredible progress. Rings unlocked, pathways opened, and his fingers moved deeper into the labyrinth's intricate layers. Arthur watched, his face a stony mask, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The entity was impossibly fast, its understanding of complex systems seemingly instantaneous. It saw patterns Arthur had taken years to design, and unraveled them in seconds. But then, the labyrinth began to push back. The visitor twisted a silver ring, expecting it to open the final layer, but instead, the entire sphere reconfigured. Pathways that were open a moment ago now closed. Gears that had been aligned now spun in opposite directions. The internal light flickered from a soft white to a chaotic, pulsing red. The visitor paused, his fingers hovering over the device. He had followed the logic perfectly, yet the outcome was illogical. He tried a different approach, attempting to trace the connections from the inside out. But the labyrinth seemed to read his intent. It presented him with paradoxes. A gear that turned both clockwise and counterclockwise simultaneously. A pathway that seemed to lead inwards but ended up back on the outer surface. It was a machine built not on physics, but on philosophy. It was a trap for the purely logical mind. The sand in the hourglass continued its relentless pour. Half was gone now. The visitor's placid expression remained, but there was a new intensity to his focus. He was no longer just manipulating the sphere, he was wrestling with it. His fingers flew across the surface, moving with a speed that blurred, but the labyrinth was always one step ahead. It was a reflection of a human life, full of false starts, of paths that led nowhere, of memories that reshaped the past and altered the future. It was messy, chaotic, and deeply, stubbornly illogical. Arthur allowed himself a sliver of hope. He had not designed a puzzle to be solved. He had designed a monument to the unsolvable complexity of a single, lived life. The last grains of sand were now falling. 10 seconds. 9. 8. The visitor made one final, desperate move, plunging his fingers deep into a newly opened chasm in the sphere, reaching for the core. The internal light flared violently, and for a moment, Arthur thought he had done it. He thought he saw a path clear to the still, dark center. But at the last possible second, a final, blued steel ring slid into place, blocking the path with a soft, final click. The last grain of silvery sand fell. Silence. The hourglass was empty. The visitor slowly withdrew his hand from the Chronos labyrinth. The sphere's internal light faded back to a gentle white pulse, its rings and gears settling into a new, impossibly complex configuration. Arthur finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the workbench to steady himself. "Time's up," he said, his voice raspy. The visitor looked from the empty hourglass, to the unsolvable sphere, and finally, to the old man standing before him. The calm mask was back in place, but Arthur could see something new in those ancient, placid eyes, a flicker of something akin to respect. The entity gave a single, slow nod. "The terms were stated," he said, his voice even. "The wager is concluded." He turned, his charcoal suit once again making him seem like a shadow. He walked towards the door, his steps as silent as they were upon his arrival. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Arthur Pendleton, who stood alone amid his life's work. "You are a very clever man, Arthur Pendleton," the visitor said. You have bought yourself a reprieve. Enjoy it." Then he was gone. And as the door clicked shut, a sound erupted in the shop. A tick. Then another. And another. A chorus of 100 clocks, all springing back to life at once, their symphony of heartbeats filling the dead silence. Arthur stood trembling, listening to the triumphant, life-affirming sound. He had done it. He had faced the end and had turned it away with nothing but his wits and his work. He had won. He had a century. 100 years. The thought was so staggering, so immense, that he laughed, a dry, cracking sound. Then he sank onto his stool, the laughter slowly turning into the quiet, shuddering sobs of a man who had just outsmarted death, and was only now beginning to understand what that might truly cost. The symphony of ticking clocks was a sound Arthur had known his entire life, but now it sounded different. Louder. More insistent. Each tick was not a countdown to an inevitable end, but a confirmation of his impossible victory. Each talk was a beat in the first measure of a new life he hadn't asked for and couldn't comprehend. He sat on his stool, the shuddering sobs subsiding into a profound and unnerving calm. The adrenaline from his confrontation had vanished, leaving behind a hollow space filled with a single, deafening question. What now? He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a 74-year-old man, etched with wrinkles, dotted with age spots, the knuckles swollen slightly from a lifetime of meticulous labor. He had always seen them as reliable but failing tools, their remaining usefulness measured in years, perhaps months. Now, they were instruments with a century-long warranty. The thought was absurd, a cognitive dissonance that made his head spin. He tried to return to his work, to the familiar comfort of the Omega watch he'd been mending. Its tiny universe of gears was his sanctuary. But as he picked up his finest tweezers, he found his hand was trembling uncontrollably. Not from age or weakness, but from the aftershock of his ordeal. The delicate mechanism on his bench was a simple, predictable system. He now existed outside of such systems. He gently put the tweezers down, realizing that work, for today, was impossible. He closed the shop early, turning the sign on the door to "Closed," and locking the deadbolt he hadn't touched in years. The world outside seemed both alien and achingly familiar. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. A young couple walked past, laughing, their heads close together. A group of children raced by on scooters, their shouts echoing down the quiet street. For them, it was just another Tuesday. For Arthur, it was the first day of a new, undefined existence. He felt like a ghost, an observer untethered from the natural flow of life and time that swept everyone else along. That evening, as he prepared a simple meal in his small apartment above the shop, he noticed the first anomaly. For the last 10 years, a dull, persistent ache of arthritis had been his constant companion, a fire in the joints of his fingers that made the first few hours of every morning a trial of stiffness and pain. It was the bane of his craft, a cruel irony for a man whose life depended on the steadiness of his hands. As he reached for a pot on the stove, he realized the pain was gone. He stopped, his hand hovering in midair. He flexed his fingers. Once, twice. There was no stiffness, no familiar, grinding protest from his knuckles. He made a tight fist, something he usually couldn't do without a wince, and felt only the smooth, supple movement of muscle and bone. The fire was out. He ran his hands under warm water, then cold, waiting for the familiar ache to return. It didn't. A cold knot of dread and wonder formed in his stomach. The visitor had promised to leave him for 100 years. He had said nothing about the terms of that existence. This wasn't just a postponed appointment. It was a fundamental alteration. The rules had been rewritten. The natural decay of his body, the slow, inevitable decline he had come to accept, had been paused. The following weeks unfolded in a strange, surreal rhythm. The first few days, he was jumpy, half expecting the man in the charcoal suit to reappear in his doorway, announcing it had all been a test or a trick. But the bell on the door only announced regular customers. Mrs. Gable with her husband's old Elgin. Mr. Chen with a cuckoo clock that had lost its voice. They saw him as the same Arthur Pendleton, the quiet, skilled watchmaker. They complained about the weather, about their health, about the relentless passage of time, and Arthur would nod and listen, a silent secret locked behind his eyes. He was an actor now, playing the part of a mortal man on the final stretch of his journey. His work, however, became transcendent. With hands free of pain and a focus unburdened by the anxieties of old age, his skill reached new heights. He restored timepieces that other experts had declared hopeless. His fingers were as nimble as they had been at 30, his eyesight, even without his loupe, seemed sharper. Word of his reinvigorated talent spread, and soon, collectors and enthusiasts were making pilgrimages to his small shop in Providence. He was no longer just a master craftsman, He was becoming a legend. But with every compliment, his sense of isolation grew. He watched his few remaining friends grow friendlier. His old chess partner, Bill, now had trouble remembering his openings. His neighbor, Eleanor, spoke of her grandchildren's latest accomplishments, her voice tinged with the melancholy of knowing she wouldn't see them grow up. Arthur would listen, offering platitudes, all the while feeling the gulf between them widening into an impassable chasm. They were on a departing train, and he was left standing on the platform. One evening, about 3 months after the visitor's departure, he found himself staring at the object that had become both his savior and his curse. The Chronos labyrinth sat on its pedestal, its internal light pulsing with a soft, rhythmic glow, like a sleeping heart. He had won the wager, but the victory felt hollow because he didn't understand it. He had built the labyrinth on instinct, on a lifetime's worth of accumulated knowledge, pouring his own memories and paradoxes into its design. It was more an act of art than of engineering. He knew how it worked, but he didn't truly know why. He had been given a century of time. He could do anything. He could travel, learn new languages, read every book he'd ever wanted to. But those were distractions. He was a man of systems, a man who solved puzzles. And the greatest puzzle of his life was no longer how to fix a watch, but how to comprehend the existence he now found himself in. He ran a now supple finger over the labyrinth's cool, metallic surface. The bargain had not just been with death, it had been with this machine. The visitor couldn't solve it, but what if the one who built it couldn't either? Was he merely the beneficiary of its power, or was he now its custodian? Its prisoner? A new purpose began to crystallize in his mind. He had 100 years. Time was no longer his enemy, it was his medium. He would not just wait out his century. He would spend it studying, dissecting, and understanding the Chronos labyrinth. He would map its infinite pathways, translate its cryptic symbols, and unlock the secret of the motionless gear at its heart. He had outsmarted death with a puzzle. Now, he would spend his impossible gift of time solving it himself. His real work was just beginning. The first year of Arthur Pendleton's new life passed like a dream. On the surface, very little changed. He still opened his shop at 9 in the morning and closed it at 5 in the evening. He still drank his coffee black and read the newspaper front to back. To the world, he was simply a man enjoying a remarkably healthy old age, his legendary skill as a watchmaker having a late-in-life renaissance. But beneath the placid surface of this routine, a secret, second life had taken hold. Every night, after the last customer had left and the city of Providence had settled into a quiet hum, Arthur's true work would begin. His workshop would transform from a place of repair to a laboratory of esoteric science. The subject of his obsessive study was the Chronos labyrinth. It sat on its pedestal, a silent, glittering enigma, and Arthur orbited it like a lonely planet around a mysterious star. He did not dare try to disassemble it. He knew instinctively that its magic was in its wholeness, in the impossible balance of its components. Instead, he studied it. He bought a high-resolution camera and photographed it from every conceivable angle, enlarging the images to study the microscopic symbols etched into its rings. He filled dozens of notebooks with meticulous diagrams, charting the slow, almost imperceptible shifts in the labyrinth's configuration. He discovered its patterns were not random. They seemed to correspond to celestial events, the phases of the moon, the turning of the seasons, the alignment of the planets. It was a clock that didn't tell human time, but cosmic time. During this year, the world outside his window began its slow, inexorable march forward. An old-fashioned diner on the corner, a place he'd eaten at for 40 years, closed down and was replaced by a sleek, minimalist coffee shop with loud music. The family-owned bookstore across the street, its windows always filled with dusty treasures, was sold and turned into a garish mobile phone store. Each small change was a reminder that the world was moving on without him. He was a fixed point, a statue in a flowing river, and he could feel the current of time eroding the familiar landscape around him. The most painful erosion, however, was happening to his oldest friend, Bill. Their weekly chess games in the park had been a cornerstone of Arthur's life for 3 decades. But the games were no longer the fierce battles of intellect they once were. Bill, a retired history professor with a mind once as sharp as a scalpel, was fading. At first, it was small things, forgetting a complex opening, repeating a story he told just last week. Arthur would gently steer the conversation, pretending not to notice. But as the months wore on, Bill's condition worsened. One crisp autumn afternoon, exactly 1 year after the visitor's arrival, they sat at their usual stone table in the park. Bill stared at the chessboard for a long time, a look of profound confusion on his face. He picked up his rook and tried to move it diagonally, like a bishop. "Bill," Arthur said softly, "rooks go in straight lines." Bill looked up, and for a terrifying moment, his eyes were vacant. He didn't seem to recognize Arthur. Then, a flicker of awareness returned, followed by a wave of shame and fear. "I'm sorry, Art," he murmured, his hand trembling as he put the piece down. "It's all jumbled up today." He looked at his friend, his eyes pleading. "It's not fair. You look exactly the same as you did 10 years ago. As sharp as ever. What's your secret?" The question, meant as a compliment, felt like a physical blow to Arthur. The secret was a monstrous, cosmic bargain that had severed him from the human experience. It was a secret that isolated him completely. He could fix any clock in the world, but he couldn't turn back the hands for his friend. He could only offer a useless lie. "Just lucky, I guess, Bill," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. 2 weeks later, the phone call came. It was Bill's daughter, her voice thick with tears. Bill had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His heart had simply stopped. A natural conclusion to a long and well-lived life. Arthur attended the funeral on a cold, gray November day. He stood in the back, listening as friends and family shared stories of Bill's life, his passion for history, his terrible jokes, his love for his family. It was a celebration of a completed journey. Everyone there was grieving the loss of a man who had traveled the same road they were on, just reaching the destination a little sooner. Arthur felt a grief so profound and so alienating he thought it might tear him in two. He wasn't on their road anymore. He was on a circular track with no exit. That night, he returned not to his apartment, but to the silent workshop. The ticking of the clocks, his symphony of victory, now sounded like a heartless, mocking metronome, counting out the moments his friend no longer had. He walked to the Chronos labyrinth, its gentle, white pulse offering no comfort. All his study, all his diagrams, all his theories felt like a fool's errand. He had 100 years of life, but what was the value of that life without the people who gave it meaning? A wave of grief and anger, emotions he had kept tightly coiled inside him, finally broke free. He placed his hands on the cool, smooth surface of the sphere. He didn't try to turn a ring or solve a sequence. He just pressed his forehead against the metal, the intricate gears a cold reality against his skin. "What's the point?" he whispered into the heart of the machine, his voice cracking. "What is the point of this stillness if everyone else keeps moving away?" He expected nothing. Silence. The soft hum of the device. But then, something happened. Deep within the labyrinth's core, a single tiny symbol he had never been able to properly decipher, a spiral turning in on itself, began to glow. It wasn't the neutral white pulse he was used to. It was a soft, melancholic, sapphire blue. The light was not a mechanical function. It felt like a response. It felt like it was listening. Arthur slowly lifted his head, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the glowing blue spiral. The labyrinth wasn't just a cosmic clock or an impossible puzzle. It was something more. It was aware. And in his moment of deepest despair, it had finally shown him a new piece of the mystery. His solitary quest to understand the machine had just become a dialogue. Arthur stared, mesmerized, at the glowing blue spiral deep within the Chronos labyrinth. The light was soft, yet it seemed to fill the entire workshop, eclipsing the dim electric bulbs overhead. The grief that had racked him just moments before was still present, but it was now mirrored, acknowledged. He was not shouting into a void. The void was answering. With a trembling hand, he reached out and gently touched the smooth, cool ring where the blue symbol shone. The moment his skin made contact with the metal, a sensation coursed through him. It was not a shock or a vibration, but a feeling, a wave of profound, ancient melancholy. It was the echo of 1,000 farewells, the quiet sorrow of watching stars burn out, the patient grief of stone witnessing empires turn to dust. It was a feeling of loss so vast it dwarfed his own personal sorrow, yet it did not diminish it. Instead, it cradled it. For the first time since Bill's death, Arthur did not feel entirely alone. This single, responsive glow fundamentally changed his quest. He was no longer a cartographer mapping a dead machine. He was an explorer attempting to communicate with a silent, ancient consciousness. His nights in the workshop took on a new fervor. He began a new set of notebooks, these filled not with diagrams of gears, but with observations of light. He discovered, through painstaking trial and error, that the labyrinth responded to his own emotional state. One evening, remembering the joy of his wedding day, a sunburst-shaped gear near the core began to emit a warm, golden radiance. When he recalled a moment of sharp fear from his childhood, a near miss with a speeding car, a different set of symbols flickered with a cold, unsettling violet light. Curiosity, concentration, contentment, each state of being was met with a unique, luminous reply. He had discovered a language of light, a form of empathic communication that transcended words. He spent his nights telling the labyrinth the story of his life. He spoke of his late wife, Helen, of her laughter that could fill a room, and the labyrinth would glow with a gentle, rose-colored hue. He described the satisfaction of repairing a particularly difficult timepiece, and a steady, confident green light would shine from its center. He was no longer just its custodian, he was its companion. 5 years passed in this strange, secret dialogue. To the outside world, Arthur Pendleton was now a man approaching 80, though he looked and felt no different than he had on the day of the visitor's arrival. His hair remained a stubborn steel gray, his hands were as steady as a surgeon's, his eyes as clear as they'd been at 50. The neighborhood continued its relentless transformation. The young couple he'd once seen were now parents, their child a small boy who would sometimes press his face against the shop window to marvel at the clocks. Arthur would smile and wave, a man living in a photograph while the world developed around him. His isolation was his shield, his secret a heavy but protective cloak. His communication with the labyrinth, however, had reached an impasse. He understood its emotional vocabulary, but he could glean no factual knowledge from it. He would ask it questions aloud. Who made you? Where are you from? Are there others like you? The only response would be a soft, yellow glow from a gear shaped like a stylized eye, the light of inquiry itself. It could mirror his questions, but it could not provide answers. He felt he was missing a key, a Rosetta Stone to translate its feelings into facts. His self-imposed solitude was about to be challenged. It began with a letter, written on heavy cream stationery bearing the crest of Brown University. It was from a doctoral candidate named Eliza Vance. She was writing her dissertation on antiquarian horology and pre-scientific mechanics, and she politely requested an interview with the living legend of Providence. Arthur, who had become adept at deflecting all forms of public attention, sent back a polite but firm refusal, citing his age and desire for privacy. Eliza Vance, however, was persistent. A second letter followed, then a phone call which he politely ended. Finally, one Tuesday afternoon, the bell on his shop door chimed, and a young woman stood there. She was tall and energetic, with a cascade of dark, curly hair tied back in a messy bun and eyes that shone with a fierce, scholarly intelligence. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Eliza Vance. I apologize for intruding, but your work is too important to be left undocumented." Arthur felt a wall of practiced refusal rise within him. "I'm afraid I have nothing to say for your dissertation, Miss Vance. I am a simple repairman." "With all due respect, sir, you're not," she countered, her tone respectful but firm. "You restored the 17th century Coventry automaton, a piece the National Museum said was unsalvageable. You are the only person alive who understands its principles. I just want to understand your process." "My process is my own," he said stiffly, preparing to show her the door. "I understand," she said, her expression softening. "Maybe I could just show you something. Something that made me so determined to speak with you." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. She flipped it open to a bookmarked page. On it was a crisp, detailed pencil drawing of a complex symbol. It was a geometric shape, a circle containing a triangle, which in turn contained a bisected hourglass. It was one of the few symbols on the labyrinth that had never responded to him, one that remained inert and dark no matter what emotion or memory he projected. "I found this in a medieval Arabic translation of a much older Alexandrian text," Eliza explained, her voice quick with academic passion. "The text is obscure, mostly myth, describing a series of artifacts called the Instruments of Thoth. This symbol is supposedly the maker's mark for a device the text calls the Chronos Labyrinth, or the Labyrinth of Time. Most experts dismiss it as folklore, but I..." She trailed off, her intelligent eyes locking onto his. "I thought a master of horology might have seen a similar design in his work." Arthur stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. The name, the symbol. This stranger, this bright, tenacious young woman, had stumbled upon a piece of his impossible secret. For 5 years, he had been the sole keeper of the mystery. Now, a key had just walked in through his front door. He was faced with a choice. He could retreat into the safety of his solitude, or he could open the door just a crack and risk everything for a chance at a real answer. He looked from the drawing in her book to the corner of his workshop where the labyrinth sat silently on its pedestal, guarding secrets he was no longer sure he could unlock alone. Arthur Pendleton felt as if one of his own clockwork mechanisms had seized inside his chest. For 5 years, the Chronos Labyrinth had been his secret, a universe of two, himself and the silent, luminous intelligence within the sphere. The thought of a third party entering that delicate world was terrifying. Yet, the symbol this young woman held in her notebook was a key he did not possess, a piece of the puzzle that had originated from outside his own secluded existence. His solitude had reached the limits of its usefulness. He stared at the drawing, then his eyes met Eliza Vance's. They were bright with an academic fire, but also with a genuine, searching curiosity. He saw in them not the predatory ambition of a debunker or a fame-seeker, but the honest passion of a fellow puzzle solver. His decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. "The design is familiar," Arthur said, his voice carefully measured. He was a man testing the ice on a frozen lake, unsure of its thickness. "I have come across many strange and esoteric designs in my years of restoring antique automata. The old masters were not just mechanics, they were philosophers, alchemists." He stepped back from the door, making a small gesture inwards. "Come into the workshop. The light is better here." Eliza's face brightened, relieved at having breached his wall of refusal. She stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the controlled chaos of his inner sanctum. The lathes and presses, the tiny drawers filled with gears and screws, the detailed diagrams pinned to the walls. And in the corner, on its heavy oak pedestal, a shape concealed beneath a familiar, worn velvet cloth. Her gaze lingered on it for a moment before she turned her attention back to Arthur. "So you think the text could be based on a real device?" she asked, her voice hushed with a reverence for the space she was in. "The line between myth and history is often thinner than we think," Arthur replied, pulling a stool out for her. He remained standing, a subtle way of maintaining control of the situation. "Tell me more about this labyrinth of time. What else does your research say?" He was interrogating her, but cloaking it in the guise of professional curiosity. Eliza, thrilled to have found a receptive ear, needed no encouragement. She spoke for nearly half an hour, her words painting a picture that expanded Arthur's understanding exponentially. The Chronos Labyrinth, she explained, was supposedly one of several instruments of Thoth. The legends were fragmented, scattered across texts in multiple languages, but they all hinted at a single mysterious creator, or perhaps a guild of creators, referred to only as the architect. "The architect wasn't a scientist in our sense," Eliza explained, leaning forward, her hands animated as she spoke. "The texts describe him as someone who didn't see a difference between physics and consciousness. He believed that fundamental forces could be woven into physical objects, that a machine could be designed to interact with time not as a measurement, but as a dimension. He built a compass of gravity, a loom of life, and the labyrinth. Of course," she added, a touch of academic caution returning to her voice, "it's all treated as allegory." Arthur listened, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. A loom of life. A compass of gravity. His world, which had already expanded to an impossible size, was now hinting at an entire hidden cosmos. He had to know if he could trust her with the reality. "Miss Vance," he interjected softly, "let me ask you a hypothetical question." He paused, choosing his words with the care he would use to set a watch's balance wheel. "If such an artifact were not an allegory? If you were to find a machine that seemed to operate outside the known laws of physics, a device that could, for instance, respond to human emotion, what would you do?" Eliza looked at him, her brow furrowed in thought. She didn't laugh or dismiss the question. She took it seriously. "It would mean that our entire model of the universe is incomplete," she said after a moment. "It would prove that consciousness isn't just an accident of biology, but a fundamental property of reality, capable of interacting with the physical world in ways we don't yet understand." Her eyes shone. "It would be the single greatest discovery in human history. It would need to be protected, studied with reverence, not dismantled like a common engine." That was the answer. It was the only answer that mattered. She saw the potential not for fame or fortune, but for wonder. Arthur gave a slow nod. "Folklore sometimes has a basis in truth," he said, his voice quiet. He walked over to the pedestal in the corner, the one she had glanced at when she first entered. The velvet cloth was dusty, mundane. What it concealed was not. "Over a long life," Arthur continued, his hand resting on the cloth, "a man who deals in timepieces sees many strange things. Sometimes he acquires them. I came into possession of this piece decades ago. I believed it was just an elaborate, non-functional puzzle box. A master craftsman's folly." He took a corner of the cloth between his thumb and forefinger. Eliza leaned forward on her stool, her breath held in anticipation. "I was wrong," he said. He pulled the cloth away. The Chronos Labyrinth sat revealed in the dim workshop light. It absorbed and refracted the light, its interlocking rings of silver and gold and blued steel seeming to hum with a silent, contained energy. It was beautiful and perfect and utterly impossible. Eliza Vance stood up slowly, her own notebook forgotten in her lap, her face a mask of utter, unadulterated awe. Her academic chase, her mythical artifact, the subject of her dissertation, was real. It was right in front of her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She took a tentative step forward, as one would approach a sacred altar. And as she drew closer, a new phenomenon occurred. Deep within the labyrinth's core, a soft, harmonious chime, like a single note struck on a crystal glass, echoed through the workshop. A gentle, pure white light pulsed from the motionless central gear, spreading outwards through the intricate mechanism in a welcoming wave. It had never made a sound before. It was reacting to her, to this pivotal moment, to the presence of a new and welcome mind. Arthur watched the woman in the machine, and in that instant, he knew his solitary vigil was over. His world, and hers, would never be the same. The single harmonious chime from the Chronos labyrinth faded, but the gentle, welcoming pulse of white light remained. Eliza Vance stood transfixed, her scholarly composure completely shattered, replaced by the pure, unadulterated wonder of a child witnessing a miracle. She took another hesitant step closer, her hand half raised, as if she were afraid the artifact might vanish like a mirage. "May I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze flickered to Arthur, asking for permission. Arthur felt a strange sense of relief. Her first instinct was not to grab or to analyze, but to show respect. "Yes," he said softly. "It seems to be waiting for you." Eliza reached out a trembling hand and laid her fingertips against one of the cool, golden rings. Her eyes widened. Arthur could only guess at the sensation she was experiencing, but he saw the understanding dawn on her face. She was feeling it, the immense, ancient, and intelligent presence that hummed beneath the metallic shell. This was no clockwork automaton. This was something alive. She pulled her hand back as if from a static charge, her mind reeling to process the impossible data her senses had just delivered. She turned to Arthur, her thousand academic questions eclipsed by a single, fundamental one. "How?" she breathed. "Mr. Pendleton, how is this possible? Where did this come from?" This was the moment. The threshold he had to cross. The story that had lived only in his memory for 5 years would now be spoken aloud. The truth was so outlandish that he knew it would test the limits of her intellectual openness. "Please," Arthur said, gesturing again to the stool. "Sit. This is not a short story." He took a moment to fill an old electric kettle and set it to boil, the mundane act a small anchor in a conversation that was about to drift into the impossible. While the water heated, he stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have not been entirely truthful with you, Miss Vance," he began. "I did not acquire this piece decades ago. I built it. It is my life's work. But I did not understand what I had truly created until the day it was put to the test." He then told her everything that had happened on that crisp autumn afternoon 5 years ago. He spoke in a calm, even voice, the voice of a man recounting a historical event, not a supernatural encounter. He described the sudden, impossible silence as every clock in his shop stopped. He described the unremarkable man in the charcoal suit, the visitor whose presence felt like a void of absolute cold. He called him the collector, a functionary of the inevitable, letting Eliza draw her own conclusions about his identity. Eliza listened, her expression a mixture of intense focus and growing disbelief. She sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap. Arthur recounted the wager. The quiet, terrifying confidence of the visitor. The 3-minute hourglass. He described the collector's impossibly swift fingers manipulating the labyrinth, and the labyrinth's paradoxical, illogical defense. He spoke of the final grain of sand falling, the visitor's quiet acknowledgement of defeat, and his parting words. He finished with the moment the door clicked shut and 100 clocks sprang back to life. When he finished, the only sound in the workshop was the soft boiling of the kettle. Arthur poured the hot water over 2 tea bags in simple ceramic mugs, the familiar ritual a stark contrast to the unbelievable tale he had just told. He handed one to Eliza. Her hands were shaking slightly. She took a sip of the tea before speaking. "Mr. Pendleton." "Arthur," she said, her voice careful. "That is an incredible story. It's poetic. Are you sure that's exactly how it happened? The mind can play tricks during moments of extreme stress. Perhaps you had a health scare, a minor stroke, or a heart attack. And your mind created this narrative, this allegory, to process the fear of death." It was the response he had expected. The rational, scientific mind trying to fit an impossible event into a known framework. He did not get defensive. He simply set his mug down and looked at her directly. "Miss Vance, I was born in April of 1946. I am 79 years old. My 80th birthday is in the spring," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My best friend, a man 2 years my junior, died of natural causes last year. My few remaining contemporaries are in nursing homes or are struggling with the myriad ailments of advanced age." He held out his hands. They were perfectly steady. 5 years ago, I had arthritis so severe that I could barely close my fists on a cold morning. It vanished overnight. I have not had so much as a common cold since that day. You are a scientist. You believe in evidence. I am asking you to look at the evidence in front of you. He gestured from himself to the humming, glowing sphere on the pedestal. Look at me, and look at it. One of us is a living myth. The other is a man who should not, by all natural laws, exist in this state. Which is the more unbelievable? Eliza stared at him. She looked at his clear eyes, his unwrinkled brow, the impossible steadiness of his watchmaker's hands. She saw not the frailty of a man nearing 80, but the quiet vitality of a man of 60. She looked at the labyrinth, an artifact humming with an energy that defied physics. The logical explanation, that this kindly old man was delusional, was suddenly at war with a tangible, impossible evidence. A long silence stretched between them. Eliza's worldview, a carefully constructed edifice of logic and empirical data, was cracking at its foundations. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice soft. I have been alone with this secret for 5 years, Miss Vance. I have learned the labyrinth's language of light, but I cannot decipher its history or its purpose. You, with your research, found its name and its symbol in the outside world. You are the first and only other person to know any piece of this puzzle. He paused. I don't believe you found me by accident. I believe we are meant to solve this together. The offer hung in the air, immense and terrifying and irresistible. Eliza looked from the impossible man to the impossible machine. Her dissertation, her academic career, her entire future as she had planned it, all seemed to shrink into insignificance. This was the real work. This was the greatest discovery in human history, sitting in a dusty watchmaker's shop in Providence. She took a deep, steadying breath, her decision made. The skepticism in her eyes was replaced by a brilliant, determined spark. Okay, Arthur, she said, her voice clear and strong. Where do we begin? Eliza's question, where do we begin, hung in the air, filled with the weight of infinite possibility and profound uncertainty. For a moment, Arthur felt the immense burden of the last 5 years, the sheer loneliness of his secret. Now, sharing it, the burden was not halved, but transformed into a shared energy, a palpable excitement that seemed to charge the air in the dusty workshop. We begin, Arthur said, a smile touching his lips for what felt like the first time in years, by combining what we know. I have 5 years of observation. You have centuries of lore. Let's put them on the same table. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. They cleared off the main workbench, a wide, sturdy oak table stained with the oils and solvents of 100,000 repairs. Arthur carefully carried over his stacks of notebooks, their pages filled with his cramped, precise handwriting and intricate diagrams of the labyrinth's light patterns. Eliza, with equal reverence, unpacked her satchel, laying out facsimile copies of ancient texts, translations, and her own notebooks filled with theories and cross-references. The two worlds collided on the surface of the bench, Arthur's intuitive, empirical observations next to Eliza's structured, historical research. His detailed notes on which emotions corresponded to which glowing symbols were laid beside her translations of allegorical descriptions of a mythical device. It was the fusion of art and science, of experience and theory. This is fascinating, Eliza murmured, poring over one of Arthur's notebooks. You've created a complete emotional lexicon. Joy, grief, fear. You've mapped its empathic responses. But you said you could never get any factual information from it. It would only ever mirror my questions, Arthur confirmed. It would acknowledge my curiosity, but never satisfy it. Maybe you weren't asking the right questions, Eliza mused. Or maybe you were asking them in the wrong language. She pointed to the drawing of the maker's mark she had first shown him, the circle, triangle, and bisected hourglass. My research suggests this isn't just a signature. It's a key. The texts call it the symbol of the architect, and they say it represents the balance of creation, intention, and time. She looked up, her eyes bright. Arthur, what if the labyrinth isn't just meant to respond to raw emotion? What if it's designed to respond to the focused intention of a creator? Her words struck a deep chord within him. He was a creator, a maker. It was the very core of his identity. And there's more, she said, pushing a different drawing across the table. It depicted a stylized loom, its threads forming a double helix. This symbol is associated with the loom of life. The legends say the loom could repair the patterns of the living. And look. She pointed to another sketch, this one of a compass whose needle was a bolt of lightning. The compass of gravity, which could reveal the hidden pressures of the world. Arthur stared at the symbols, a jolt of recognition running through him. He immediately went to the high-resolution photographs of the labyrinth he had pinned to a corkboard. Cross-referencing them with her drawings, he found what he was looking for. There, etched onto two small dormant steel rings deep within the labyrinth structure, were the very same symbols, the loom and the compass. They were symbols that had never glowed, never responded to his emotional probing. "They're all here," Arthur whispered in awe. "It's not just the labyrinth. It's a nexus, a key to the others. A control panel," Eliza breathed. "And if the architect's mark is the key, maybe you, as a fellow builder, a creator, are the only one who can turn it." A new, daring experiment began to take shape. They decided to focus on the loom of life symbol. Eliza theorized that to activate it, Arthur needed to project more than a simple memory or a raw emotion. He needed to channel the very essence of creation itself. "Think about how you felt when you were building this," Eliza urged, her voice a hushed, intense guide. "Not just the frustration or the satisfaction. Think about the moment an idea first sparked. The intention. The will to bring something new into existence where there was nothing before. Focus on that feeling, and channel it through the architect's mark." Arthur closed his eyes. He stood before the labyrinth, placing one hand gently on the inert maker's mark, and the other on the dormant symbol of the loom. He pushed away the memories of the past 5 years, the fear, the loneliness, the grief. He reached further back, into the quiet, obsessive decade he had spent designing and assembling the sphere before him. He remembered the thrill of solving an impossible mechanical problem. He recalled the pure, unadulterated joy of creation, of seeing intricate parts come together to form a beautiful, harmonious whole. He focused all of that creative will, all of that maker's intent, into a single point of pure, focused energy. He felt a faint vibration under his fingertips. He opened his eyes. The architect's mark was glowing with a brilliant, diamond-white light. That light flowed like a current across the surface of the labyrinth, directly into the symbol of the loom, which erupted in a vibrant, emerald-green glow. The entire device hummed, not with a single chime, but with a deep, resonant chord. Then, the impossible happened. A beam of soft, green light shot from the center of the labyrinth, not hitting the ceiling, but projecting an image onto the dusty, wood-planked wall of the workshop. It was a map. It wasn't a map of countries or continents, but a shimmering, three-dimensional web of faint ley lines, like a glowing spiderweb stretched across a dark canvas. And on that web were points of light, like stars in a constellation. One of those stars, where they stood now in Providence, shone with a bright, steady, emerald fire. Scattered across the globe were other, fainter points of light, one deep in the deserts of Egypt, another high in the Andes, a third in the heart of a teeming Asian metropolis. Arthur and Eliza stood side by side, bathed in the ethereal green glow, staring at the celestial map on the wall. They had sought to understand a single artifact. Instead, they had just been given a quest. The labyrinth wasn't just a puzzle or a key. It was a guide. It was showing them the way. Their small workshop had suddenly become the starting point on a journey that would span the entire world. The glowing green map shimmered on the workshop wall, a silent testament to a world far larger and more mysterious than either Arthur or Eliza had ever conceived. The initial shock of the revelation slowly gave way to a dawning, electrifying sense of purpose. They were no longer just guardians of a secret, they were inheritors of a quest. For the next several hours, they worked with a focused intensity. Eliza, in her element, meticulously photographed the projection from every angle. Her cameras flash a series of small lightning strikes in the dim room. She sketched the entire star-like pattern into her notebook, carefully transcribing the web of ley lines and the precise locations of the glowing points. Arthur, meanwhile, observed the labyrinth itself. The architect's mark and the loom symbol still glowed, but the rest of the sphere was now cycling through a slow, complex pattern of lights he'd never seen before. It was as if a new layer of its consciousness had awakened. "We can't just guess," Eliza said, finally looking up from her sketches. "There are at least 7 other points of light on this map. We need to choose our first destination logically." "Some are brighter than others," Arthur observed, pointing to a particularly brilliant node that corresponded to the deserts of North Africa. "True," Eliza agreed, tapping her pen against her chin. "But brightness might mean power, which could also mean it's better guarded or harder to reach. We should start with the one that gives us the most information." Her eyes scanned her drawings. "Look at this one. The node in what looks like Central Europe. It's not the brightest, but it's pulsing. A slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat." She cross-referenced the location with a digital map on her tablet. "It's Prague," she breathed. "The Czech Republic." A spark of recognition lit up her face. "Arthur, my texts have multiple, overlapping references to a 16th century Prague school of alchemical mechanics. It was led by a master craftsman who was rumored to be a student of the architect himself. They believed music, resonance, and mechanics were all facets of the same divine art. The pulsing light on the map, the heartbeat, the historical connection to resonance. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. Their first destination had been chosen. The next week was a blur of practical preparations that felt surreal when contrasted with the fantastical nature of their goal. Arthur, who had not left the state of Rhode Island in 20 years, had to renew his passport. He had lived a frugal life, and his savings, originally intended for a quiet retirement, were more than sufficient. "I suppose this is a kind of retirement," he'd remarked wryly. "Just a bit more ambitious than I'd planned." The most nerve-wracking moment came at the airport. Arthur, legally an 80-year-old man, stood before the passport control officer, a young woman who looked at his photo, taken 10 years prior, already showing a man in his 70s, and then at the unnaturally vital man standing before her. For a tense second, her eyes narrowed slightly. Arthur's heart, which he now knew was immune to the ravages of time, still hammered against his ribs. This was the first true test of his secret in the unforgiving, bureaucratic light of the real world. The officer scanned his passport, looked at him one more time, and then, with an indifferent shrug, stamped it and waved him through. The world was too busy to notice the impossible. Their cover story was simple and effective: a renowned, elderly horological expert and his promising doctoral protege on a research trip across Europe to study rare historical automata. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. The flight across the Atlantic was a disorienting experience for Arthur. As the plane climbed above the clouds, he looked down at the shrinking coastline of America, the country that had contained his entire life. For 80 years, his world had been the size of a workshop. Now, it was the size of the globe. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, a man unstuck from his own time, now unstuck from his own place as well. They arrived in Prague on a cool, misty morning. The city was a fairy tale carved from stone and shadow. The air smelled of coal smoke and old history. As they took a taxi across the ancient Charles Bridge, its cobblestones rumbling beneath the tires, Arthur saw the Gothic spires of the castle looming over the city like silent, watchful giants. He had spent his life with machines that measured time. This city felt like a place that had swallowed it. They began their work at the Strahov Monastery Library, a magnificent hall of ancient books and celestial globes. Under the guise of Eliza's research, they were granted access to archives that were rarely seen by the public. For 2 days, they sifted through dusty, leather-bound folios and brittle scrolls, the silence of the library broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages. On the third day, they found it. Tucked away in the private, unpublished journal of a 16th-century astronomer named Jakub Krusin, Eliza found a chapter on what he called celestial resonance. And in the margin, next to a paragraph describing a device meant to harmonize the soul with the music of the spheres, was a small, unmistakable drawing. It was a diagram of an intricate, cage-like object made of interlocking brass rings, with what looked like a crystal suspended at its center. It was titled, in Krusin's spidery Latin script, Machina Resonantia, the resonance machine. And beneath the title, so small Arthur almost missed it, was the maker's mark, the circle, triangle, and bisected hourglass of the architect. But it was the note scrawled beside the diagram that made both their hearts stop. It was not an address, but a riddle. Where the golem sleeps and numbers count the stars, its voice waits in the heart of the sixth house. Eliza looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with excitement and trepidation. "The golem of Prague," she whispered. "According to legend, its body rests in the attic of the old new synagogue, in the old Jewish quarter. And the sixth house. Jewish astrology often assigns numbers to the houses. It's a real place." They finally had a specific destination. The map had led them to the city. The city's history had led them to a book. And the book had given them a riddle that pointed to a single, ancient neighborhood. The hunt was on. Armed with a riddle from a 400-year-old journal, Arthur and Eliza left the hallowed silence of the library and stepped into the living history of Prague's Jewish quarter. The district, known as Josefov, was a labyrinth of narrow, cobblestone lanes where modern life flowed around ancient synagogues and centuries-old townhouses like a river around stubborn stones. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch, as if the ghosts of the past were stirring for the evening. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the unwritten stories of generations. Their quest began in the shadow of the old new synagogue, the legendary resting place of the golem's inert body. Standing before the ancient Gothic structure, Arthur felt a strange resonance, a sense of deep time that reminded him of the labyrinth. "Okay," Eliza began, pulling out her notebook and a detailed map of the quarter. "The first line is simple, where the golem sleeps. We're in the right place. The whole neighborhood is the golem's bedroom." She tapped the second line of the riddle she had transcribed. "And numbers count the stars." "That's the real clue." "An observatory?" Arthur suggested. "The journal belonged to an astronomer." Possibly, Eliza mused, her eyes scanning the rooftops. But there are no records of a major observatory right here. I think it's more subtle. The most famous astronomer and mystic associated with the golem was Rabbi Lowe. He was a master of Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism deeply concerned with numbers, letters, and their connection to the cosmos. The riddle isn't telling us to look for a building used for astronomy, it's telling us to look for a building marked by it. Her logic was a thread of light in the historical maze. They were not looking for a place, but for a symbol. They spent the next hour walking the winding streets, their eyes trained not on the tourist shops, but on the architecture itself, the stone lintels above doors, the faded frescoes on walls, the wrought iron flourishes on window grates. They found several houses with the number 6 on them, but they were all wrong. One was a modern apartment building, another a brightly lit souvenir shop selling marionettes. They were just addresses, devoid of any deeper meaning. Discouraged, they paused in a small, quiet square. Maybe we're thinking about this too literally, Eliza said, frustration creeping into her voice. What if the 6th house isn't a number on a door? Her eyes suddenly lit up. Arthur, Tiferet. In the Kabbalistic tree of life, the 6th emanation is Tiferet. It represents harmony, balance, and beauty. It's the central point of equilibrium. It connects everything. Harmony, Arthur repeated, the word striking a chord. The device was called a resonance machine. It was meant to create harmony. Exactly, Eliza exclaimed. We're not looking for the number 6. We're looking for a symbol of harmony, a place where numbers count the stars in a balanced, beautiful way. With this new perspective, their search was transformed. They began looking for patterns, for sacred geometry hidden in plain sight. And on a quiet, forgotten lane just off the main square, they found it. It was an unassuming, 3-story townhouse, its plaster facade grayed with age. But carved into the heavy stone lintel above the dark oak door was a symbol. It was a 6-pointed star, and nestled within each of its points was a smaller, intricately carved star. At its center was a stylized sun. It was a perfect, harmonious model of a tiny solar system. Numbers, in the form of stars, counting a central star. This is it, Eliza whispered, her voice filled with awe. The heart of the 6th house. The house seemed dormant, its windows dark and coated with grime. There was no bell or knocker, only a large, ornate iron lock, rusted with age. Arthur, the craftsman, stepped forward to examine it. It was a masterpiece of 16th-century locksmithing, a device as complex as any clock he had ever repaired. We can't just break it down, he murmured, his fingers tracing the intricate ironwork. But as he examined it, he saw it wasn't a standard key and tumbler lock. In the center, almost invisible against the dark iron, was a small, circular plate with 3 distinct pressure points, arranged in a triangle. Eliza saw it too. A puzzle lock, she breathed. I believe so, Arthur said. His mind raced. A 3-point sequence. He thought of the architect's mark, the circle, the triangle, the bisected hourglass. Creation, intention, time. It was a long shot, a leap of pure intuition. With a deep breath, he placed his steady fingers on the pressure points. He pressed the top point first, representing the wholeness of the circle of creation. Nothing happened. He then pressed the bottom 2 points simultaneously, representing the foundation of the triangle of intention. Still nothing. He paused, thinking of the hourglass. Time flows from one point to another. He pressed the top point, held it for a second, and then released it as he pressed the bottom 2. There was a deep, grinding sound from within the door. A series of heavy tumblers, silent for 400 years, shifted and fell into place. With a final, resonant thud, the lock disengaged. Arthur and Eliza looked at each other, their hearts pounding in unison. He pulled the heavy iron handle, and the door swung inward on groaning hinges, disturbing the dust of sleeping centuries. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, carrying the scent of old paper, faded incense, and something else, the faint, metallic tang of alchemy. The entryway was dark, but as their eyes adjusted, they could see that the house was not empty. It was a perfectly preserved workshop. Strange glass alembics and retorts sat on tables, covered in a thick blanket of dust. Astrolabes and celestial charts hung on the walls, their surfaces obscured by cobwebs. In the center of the room, draped in a heavy rotted cloth, stood a large, cage-like object. They had found it. The workshop of Jakob Kersin, a time capsule sealed away since the age of emperors and alchemists. With a shared, silent understanding, they stepped across the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The click of the latch echoed in the profound silence, sealing them inside the secret house, away from the modern world. Their hunt for the resonance machine had just reached its heart. The heavy oak door clicked shut, plunging the workshop into a near-total darkness, the profound silence of a space that had not heard a human voice in centuries. The only light was a thin, dusty blade of late-afternoon sun piercing a grimy upper window. It cut through the gloom, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes that danced in its path. As Arthur and Eliza's eyes slowly adjusted, the shapes of the forgotten workshop resolved themselves from the shadows. It was a place of arcane science, a bridge between the worlds of magic and mechanics. Glassware of every conceivable shape, alembics, retorts, and coiled condensers, sat on wooden tables like a collection of sleeping, alien creatures. On the walls, between peeling celestial charts, hung tools that were a bizarre fusion of the craftsman's and the surgeon's arts. The air was a dry, brittle perfume of old paper, dust, and the faint, sharp tang of exotic chemicals long since evaporated. This was not a museum. It was a time capsule, and they were the first to break its seal. Their attention was drawn to the center of the room, to the large object draped in what was once a heavy protective cloth. It was the Machina Resonantia from Jakob Crusin's journal. With a shared look of reverence and anticipation, they each took a corner of the ancient fabric. As they lifted it, the cloth offered no resistance, disintegrating into a cascade of fine gray dust that rained down on the floor around the device. Now fully revealed, the resonance machine was a masterpiece of alchemical engineering. It stood about 4 feet high, a sphere-like cage constructed of interlocking brass rings and arches. From these rings, dozens of metallic rods of varying lengths and thicknesses, like the tines of countless tuning forks, pointed inward. At the very center of the cage, suspended by a web of what looked like silver wires, was a massive, flawless quartz crystal, as large as a human heart. It was not faceted like a gemstone, but was smooth and cloudy, seeming to hold a dormant light within its milky depths. The entire apparatus was covered in the dark green-brown patina of ages, beautiful but inert. There were no visible gears, no levers, no controls. "It's magnificent," Eliza whispered, her voice a hushed intrusion in the sacred silence. "But how does it work?" She began to circle it slowly, cross-referencing its structure with the memories of the diagrams from the journal. Arthur, the craftsman, approached it more directly. He gently ran a finger along one of the brass rings. "These rings," he observed, "they're calibrated. See these markings? They're not decorative. They're notations, like on a musical instrument." He reached out and gently flicked one of the smaller metal tines with his fingernail. A single, perfectly pure note rang out. It was a high, clear tone that seemed to hang in the dusty air for an impossibly long time before fading. The silence it left behind felt even deeper than before. Eliza's eyes lit up. "The riddle," she said, her voice electric with discovery. "Its voice waits in the heart of the 6th house. We were so focused on finding the house, we missed the second clue. It's not a machine you operate with your hands. You operate it with its voice. With sound. Resonance," Arthur affirmed, his mind connecting the pieces. "The crystal is the heart. The tines are the voice. But they're waiting for the right note to awaken them. The right chord. But what was the chord? Shouting random notes at it was pointless. They needed the specific harmonic key. For a moment, they were stumped, two brilliant minds facing a 400-year-old lock with no key. Then, Arthur remembered. They had not come to Prague empty-handed. They had brought the key to everything with them. From a specially padded leather satchel he had carried over his shoulder since they'd left Providence, Arthur carefully removed the Chronos labyrinth. Even here, in the dim, dusty workshop, it seemed to glow with its own internal light. He placed it on a small, clear space on a nearby workbench. The two instruments, one of time and one of resonance, were now in the same room, separated by a few feet and 4 centuries. "Can you ask it?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you ask it for the key? The chord to wake this one up?" Arthur nodded. It was the only logical step. He placed his hands on the labyrinth, its familiar cool metal a comfort. He closed his eyes, filtering out all distractions. He didn't focus on an emotion this time, but on a clear, precise question, an intention. He projected the concept of the resonance machine, the idea of harmony, the image of the sleeping crystal, and tied it all to a single, focused inquiry. What is the voice? What is the sound that wakes you? He felt the labyrinth stir beneath his hands. It was not a language of light he received in return. Instead, a low, soft hum began to emanate from its core. The hum grew in volume, resolving itself into a series of distinct, pure tones, all sung at once. It was a chord, but unlike any Arthur had ever heard. It was a sound of profound complexity and impossible harmony, at once melancholic and majestic. It was the sound of starlight, of gravity, of life itself, all woven into a single, resonant expression. And the resonance machine answered. As the labyrinth sang its celestial chord, the great quartz crystal at the center of the brass cage began to glow. A soft, warm, golden light pulsed from its heart, growing steadily brighter. The dozens of metallic tines began to vibrate in sympathy, their own pure notes joining the labyrinths, amplifying the sound until the entire room was filled with a powerful, bone-deep hum of cosmic harmony. The green-brown patina on the brass rings seemed to sizzle and evaporate, flaking away to reveal the gleaming, untarnished golden metal beneath. The dust of ages was shaken loose by the vibrations, rising in a cloud around the now fully awakened machine. Arthur and Eliza stood frozen, bathed in the warm, golden light, the air vibrating around them, the ancient, powerful music resonating in their very bones. They had found the second instrument. They had awoken it. And now, they stood in the presence of a power they could not begin to comprehend, its glorious and terrifying voice finally unleashed in the heart of the sleeping city. The resonant chord that filled the workshop was more than just a sound. It was a physical presence. It vibrated not in the air, but in the very bones of Arthur and Eliza, in the ancient stone walls, in the dusty glass of the forgotten alembics. Bathed in the warm golden light of the central crystal, they stood perfectly still, experiencing a sensation of profound and absolute harmony. For Arthur, it was like the feeling of finally setting the last gear of a complex watch into place, that perfect click of cosmic rightness, amplified a million times over. The subtle aches of his 80-year-old frame, the fatigue of travel, the low-grade anxiety that had been his companion for years, all of it simply dissolved. He felt a sense of mental clarity so pure it was like looking through a newly cleaned lens. For Eliza, the academic whose mind was a constant, chaotic buzz of theories and footnotes, the effect was even more pronounced. The storm of her thoughts grew calm, the waves settled, and for the first time in her adult life, her mind was utterly quiet. In that quiet, she could feel the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the soft flow of air in her lungs, the gentle, life-affirming hum of her own existence, now perfectly in tune with the golden harmony that surrounded her. Slowly, over the course of a minute that felt like an eternity, the powerful chord subsided. The sound did not vanish, but softened into a gentle, steady hum, a single sustained note that was both comforting and deeply powerful. The golden light from the crystal remained, bathing the workshop in a permanent state of ethereal twilight. The dust that had been stirred up by their entry had settled on the floor and tables, not in random clumps, but in beautiful, intricate patterns, like the sacred geometry of a mandala. What was that? Eliza breathed, her voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. Harmony, Arthur replied, his own voice sounding clearer, stronger. He looked at his hands, turning them over in the golden light. This machine, it doesn't just create a sound. It aligns things to it. It corrects dissonance. He walked slowly around the now gleaming brass device. The legends Eliza had uncovered called it the loom of life, a machine that could repair the patterns of the living. He had thought it was a metaphor. Now, standing in the palpable afterglow of its power, he suspected it was a literal description. The labyrinth was a key, a map, a device of pure intellect. This machine was something else entirely. It was a tool of biology, of life itself. The patterns, Eliza said, her scientific mind clicking back into gear, trying to process the miracle she had just witnessed. If it can harmonize a room, can it harmonize a living system? Can it repair a broken pattern? Her question hung in the golden air. How could they test it? An idea took shape in Arthur's mind, an instinct born from a lifetime of mending broken things. He scanned the cluttered workshop and his eyes fell upon a small, terracotta pot sitting on a windowsill, caked in centuries of grime. In it was the brittle, blackened stalk and crumbled leaves of a plant that had died long before either of them were born. A broken biological pattern. Guided by an impulse he didn't fully understand, Arthur picked up the pot, the dry soil crackling under his touch. He brought it over and placed it on the floor near the base of the resonance machine. He then reached out and placed his hand on one of the warm, humming brass rings. He closed his eyes, not with a question this time, but with an intention, the same one he applied to a broken watch: mend, repair, restore the proper function. The machine responded instantly. The steady golden glow from the crystal sharpened, focusing into a coherent beam of light that enveloped the dead plant. The ambient hum pitched upward, becoming a focused, intense, and yet still beautiful note. Before their astonished eyes, a miracle unfolded. The brittle, black stalk began to soften, its color lightening from charcoal to a deep brown. The cracked, dry soil around its base darkened as if being watered from within. Slowly, miraculously, a tinge of green appeared at the base of the stalk. A single tightly furled bud, no bigger than a grain of rice, began to emerge from the dead wood. The process was slow, deliberate, as the machine seemed to be patiently coaxing the very memory of life back into the dead cells. They had their answer. The The power of this device was staggering, world-altering. The ability to cure disease, to heal wounds, to correct the fundamental errors in living things. It was all encapsulated in this humming golden machine. "Arthur," Eliza whispered, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Do you realize what this means? This could end suffering. It could change everything." As she spoke, the immense danger of their discovery settled over Arthur like a shroud. A power like this was not just a gift, it was a target. In a world of discord, an instrument of perfect harmony would be the most sought-after and most dangerous object in existence. Their quiet, scholarly quest had just become a mission of the utmost importance, to protect these artifacts from a world that would tear itself apart to possess them. Their profound moment of discovery and dawning responsibility was violently shattered. Bang! A loud, splintering crash echoed from the front of the house. Both Arthur and Eliza jumped, spinning around to face the entryway. Bang! Bang! It was the sound of something heavy striking the ancient oak door. It wasn't a knock. It was an assault. Someone was trying to break in. The subtle resonance of the machine's awakening had not gone unnoticed. Their secret, hidden for 400 years, had been discovered in a matter of hours. They stood frozen in the golden glow, the miraculous hum of the newly awakened instrument in their ears, drowned out by the violent, terrifying sound of the modern world trying to smash its way in. They were trapped. They had been found. The violent sound of splintering would echoed in the golden-lit workshop, a brutal intrusion of the 21st century into a 16th century sanctuary. The harmony that had filled the room just moments before was shattered, replaced by the jarring rhythm of a determined assault. Eliza reacted with primal fear. Her academic curiosity evaporated, replaced by the cold adrenaline of a cornered animal. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. The single door was under attack. The windows were high, grimy, and fortified with ancient, rusted iron bars. They were in a stone box, a trap. Arthur, however, reacted with the cold, focused calm of a man who had already faced the ultimate adversary. Fear was present, but it was a tool, not a master. His first and only thought was not for his own safety, but for the artifacts. He had been entrusted with their care, first by his own creation, and now by history itself. "The back," Eliza whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Is there a cellar? Another way out?" Arthur scanned the room, his watchmaker's eyes looking for seams, for irregularities. But the workshop was exactly what it appeared to be, a single, sealed room, designed to protect its secrets. "There's no other exit," he said, his voice grim. The banging stopped. An unnerving silence fell for a moment, and then a new sound began, a high-pitched, metallic whine. It was a modern high-speed drill, boring its way through the ancient iron of the puzzle lock. These were not common burglars. They were professionals. They were equipped. And they knew what they were looking for. "We have to destroy it," Eliza said, her eyes fixed on the humming resonance machine. "We can't let them have it." "No," Arthur said firmly, his voice cutting through her panic. He looked at the gleaming brass instrument, at the rejuvenated plant at its base. "You don't destroy a miracle. You protect it." "But how?" They had perhaps a minute, no more. He looked at the two instruments, the machine of life and harmony, and the sphere of time and intellect. Two parts of a greater whole. On their own, they were powerful. Together. An idea sparked in his mind, a desperate, intuitive leap that bypassed logic entirely. It was the same kind of creator's instinct that had led him to build the labyrinth in the first place. "Eliza, come here," he commanded, his voice steady. "Quickly." He rushed to the resonance machine, placing his right hand flat against its vibrating surface. With his left, he scooped the Chronos labyrinth from the workbench. He pulled Eliza close, positioning her so that her hand, too, was pressed against the warm brass of the machine. "What are you doing?" she cried, as the drill outside whined, nearing its goal. "I don't know," Arthur answered honestly. "But they are connected, and we are connected to them." He pressed the cool sphere of the labyrinth against her free hand, creating a circuit. From him, through the labyrinth, through Eliza, through the resonance machine, and back to him. He closed his eyes and issued a command not with his voice, but with the full force of his will. He didn't ask a question or project an emotion. He projected a single, desperate, undeniable demand into the heart of the labyrinth. Sanctuary. "Hide us. Take us away." The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The golden light of the resonance machine and the diamond-white light of the labyrinth's architect's mark flared with blinding intensity. The two lights merged, twisting together into a spiraling helix of incandescent energy. The harmonic hum of the one and the celestial chord of the other fused into a single, deafening, reality-bending tone that vibrated through the very fabric of space. The The world around them dissolved. With a final, explosive crack, the workshop door was blasted inwards. 3 figures in dark, featureless tactical gear stormed into the room, assault rifles raised. They moved with silent, fluid efficiency, their movements disciplined and precise. They were followed by a 4th figure, a tall, severe-looking man in a long, dark coat, who surveyed the scene with cold, appraising eyes. He saw the still humming resonance machine. He saw the rejuvenated plant. He saw the dust settled in mandalas on the floor. He saw the broken teacups on the workbench. But the room was empty of people. One of the soldiers, his voice filtered through a comms unit, stated the obvious. "Sir, they're gone." The man in the coat, the proctor, walked slowly into the center of the room. The air was thick with a scent of ozone and a strange, unidentifiable energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He placed a gloved hand near the humming machine, feeling its power. "The labyrinth is gone," the proctor said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's bonded with it. It's no longer just a key, it's a part of him. The old man is a living nexus." He turned to his soldiers. "The Viridian Order has guarded these secrets for 1,000 years. We will not lose them now to a renegade clockmaker and a child." His voice was cold steel. "He can't run forever." The instruments called to each other. "Track the resonance signature. Find them." Meanwhile, in a place that was not Prague, Arthur and Eliza stumbled forward, collapsing onto a floor of cold, damp stone. The deafening sound receded, the blinding light faded. They were clutching each other, with Arthur still holding the Chronos labyrinth, which was now warm to the touch and pulsing with a soft, steady beat, like a heart after a long race. They were in darkness, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and deep, subterranean cold. They were no longer in the workshop. They had escaped. But as their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they realized they were in a cave, or a tunnel, a place of dripping water and profound, echoing silence. They were safe, but they were utterly, terrifyingly lost. The transition was not a journey, it was a schism. One moment, Arthur and Eliza were in a golden-lit workshop in Prague, the air vibrating with a celestial chord and the sound of a breaking door. The next, they were tumbling through a non-space of spiraling light and deafening sound, a place without gravity or direction. It lasted for an instant and an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. They collapsed onto a floor of cold, hard stone, the momentum of their arrival sending them sprawling. The world returned, but it was a different world. The golden light was gone, the harmonic hum silenced. They were in near total darkness, the only illumination coming from the Chronos labyrinth, which Arthur still clutched tightly in his hand. It was warm and pulsed with a soft, white, rhythmic light, like the steady beating of a faithful heart. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth, wet stone, and millennia of undisturbed stillness. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from an unseen ceiling into a pool somewhere in the darkness. "Eliza? Are you all right?" Arthur's voice was a rough whisper, absorbed by the oppressive dark. "I think so," she answered, her own voice shaky. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her breath misting in the cold. "What was that? Where are we?" "Sanctuary," Arthur murmured, looking at the glowing sphere in his hands. "I asked for sanctuary." They took a moment to collect themselves, the adrenaline of their escape slowly being replaced by a profound sense of dislocation. They were unhurt, but the transit had left them feeling drained, as if some essential energy had been drawn from them to power the journey. "It wasn't teleportation," Eliza said, her analytical mind already working, trying to impose order on the impossible. "It felt like we were pulled through something. Along a wire. The map the labyrinth showed us, the ley lines, maybe they aren't just lines on a map. Maybe they are the map. A network of tunnels, of pathways." "A door," Arthur said, his own understanding more tactile, more mechanical. The resonance machine was the power source. The labyrinth was the key. Together, they opened a door. They had stumbled into a hidden corridor of the world, a place that existed between the known points and, in between, space. They were safe from their pursuers, for the moment. But they were utterly lost. Meanwhile, back in Prague, the Viridian Order's proctor stood in the now quiet workshop. The resonance machine still hummed, a testament to the power he had just missed capturing. He ran a gloved finger through the strange, geometric patterns of dust on a table. He was not enraged by the escape, he was intrigued, and his resolve was hardened. "For 1,000 years, the Order has acted as custodians," he said, his voice low and cold, speaking to his lieutenant. "We have kept the instruments separate, dormant, preventing any one person from accumulating their power. We believe humanity must be protected from its own ambition." He looked at the rejuvenated plant, a single new green leaf now fully unfurled. This clockmaker, in his ignorance and sentimentality, is waking them up. He is creating a resonance cascade across the network. He thinks he is a savior. He is a destabilizing agent, and he must be stopped. A technician in tactical gear approached, holding a sophisticated-looking tablet. Sir, we have a trace. The energy signature from the transit is chaotic, but it left a residual echo. It's not on the surface. The signal is faint, originating from somewhere deep underground. Our best analysis puts the endpoint somewhere within the old catacomb systems, beneath Rome. The proctor allowed himself a thin, cold smile. He ran to the next nexus point. Predictable. Deploy the team. He has the map, but we have the history. We know the territory better than he does. Back in the subterranean darkness, Arthur and Eliza knew they couldn't stay put. The cold was seeping into their bones. They needed to find a way out. Which way? Eliza asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, unseen space. Arthur looked at the labyrinth. As if sensing his question, the steady, rhythmic pulse of its light began to change. It still glowed, but the light seemed to be pushing ever so slightly, in one direction down the tunnel. It was a compass. Trusting the only guide they had, they began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the profound silence. The tunnel was clearly man-made, the stone walls too smooth, the arch of the ceiling too perfect. Faint, eroded carvings covered the walls, spirals, star charts, and geometric patterns they didn't recognize. This was not a sewer or a catacomb. This was part of something far older. After what felt like an hour, the narrow tunnel opened into a large, circular chamber. In the exact center of the chamber stood a simple, unadorned stone pedestal, about waist-high, and carved onto its flat, upper surface was a single, clear symbol. Eliza gasped, rushing forward. It was a drawing she knew intimately from her research. It was a stylized compass, but its needle was a jagged, unmistakable lightning bolt. The compass of gravity, she whispered in awe. They were not in a random tunnel. The labyrinth hadn't just teleported them to a safe place. It had brought them to a waypoint, a signpost on the hidden network, pointing the way to the next instrument. As Arthur stepped closer, the labyrinth in his hands reacted to the carving. The sphere began to glow brightly, and it projected a shimmering, three-dimensional image into the air above the pedestal. It was the star map from the workshop. The node for Prague was now a faint, fading ember. A new, brilliant point of light pulsed where they now stood. And a third point, further south, was now flashing with a steady, insistent rhythm. The path forward. From a tunnel leading in the direction of that flashing node, a new sound reached them. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't dripping water. It was the low rumble of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the faint melodic peal of church bells. It was the sound of a living city. There was an exit. They stood at a crossroads, in the heart of a secret that spanned the globe. Behind them, a fading echo. Before them, a path to another, unknown instrument. And above them, an ancient city where new enemies were already beginning their hunt. Their choice was clear. Their quest had just begun. The path to the surface was a long, winding ascent. Arthur and Eliza moved from the strange, ancient tunnels of the in-between into a rough-hewn staircase that spiraled upwards into darkness. The stonework here was different, more familiar, the unmistakable, enduring craftsmanship of the Roman Empire. The air grew warmer, losing its deep, subterranean chill and taking on the scent of dry dust and sun-baked history. After what felt like an eternity of climbing, they reached a small, stone landing and a heavy, iron-banded wooden door. It was locked from their side with a simple, corroded iron bolt. With a collective grating screech that echoed down the staircase, Arthur slid the bolt free. He pushed the door open, and the brilliant golden light of a Mediterranean afternoon flooded the space, forcing them both to shield their eyes. They had surfaced. They found themselves in a small, circular, stone-walled room. The air was thick with the dust of ages. In the center was a simple, weathered stone altar, and the walls were covered in faded frescoes depicting a figure slaying a bull. It was a Mithraeum, a subterranean temple to a Roman mystery cult, a secret buried beneath more secrets. A second, steeper flight of stairs led up to another door. This lock was more modern, but still ancient by Arthur's standards. It took him only a few minutes of patient, expert work with a small file from his pocket toolkit to coax the tumblers into alignment. With a soft click, the door opened. They stepped out of the buried temple and into a narrow, sun-drenched back alley, the door swinging shut on a forgotten world behind them. The sensory overload was immediate. The air was warm and smelled of diesel fumes, garlic, and blooming jasmine. The roar of scooters, the cacophony of car horns, and the lyrical rapid-fire cadence of the Italian language formed a wall of sound. They were covered in grime from the tunnels, their clothes, bought for a Prague autumn, too heavy for the warm climate. They were aliens, time travelers who had emerged in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Eliza, ever the pragmatist, took charge. We need a hotel. We need to wash, change, and figure out where we are before we do anything else. She led the way, navigating the maze of alleys until they emerged onto a bustling street. A passing sign confirmed what the history of the tunnels had suggested. They were in Rome. An hour later, they were checked into a small, clean, and anonymous hotel on a quiet side street. As the hot water of the shower washed away the subterranean cold and grime, Arthur felt the full, staggering weight of their journey settle upon him. Days ago, he had been a reclusive watchmaker in Providence. Now he was a fugitive, custodian of a world-altering secret, standing in a hotel room in the heart of the former Roman Empire. After they had changed into new, simple clothes bought from a nearby shop, Eliza laid a map of the city out on the bed. The proctor, the man in the coat, he said his order had guarded these things for 1,000 years, she said, her voice low. They aren't just thugs, Arthur. They're organized, they have history, and they have resources. We have to assume they're already looking for us. Then we can't stay still, Arthur replied. He carefully retrieved the Chronos labyrinth from his satchel and placed it on the small desk. We need to know where to go next. He focused his will, and the labyrinth responded. The holographic map shimmered into existence in the dim hotel room. As before, the node where they stood pulsed with a bright, steady light. The Prague node was a barely visible ember. But the third point, the one that had flashed in the chamber below, was now a clear, insistent beacon. Eliza cross-referenced its position with her own map. It's not in Rome, she said, her brow furrowed. It's south, near the coast, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. The name of the infamous volcano hung in the air. She suddenly made the connection. The compass of gravity, she whispered, her eyes wide with understanding. The legend said it could reveal the hidden pressures of the world. Arthur, what has more hidden, unimaginable pressure than a dormant volcano? Their next target was not in a library or a hidden workshop. It was in a place of immense, unstable, natural power. As they began to formulate a plan, a train to Naples, a discreet way to get near the volcano, the Viridian Order was already closing in. In a lavish, antique-filled office overlooking the Roman Forum, the proctor stood before a wizened, impeccably dressed old man, a high-ranking member of the Order's Italian chapter. The Roman nexus has been dormant for centuries, Proctor, the old man said, his English precise and accented. You say this clockmaker has not only awakened it, but is traveling through it? He has the labyrinth, and it is bonded to him, the proctor replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He is an anomaly, and he is forcing the instruments to awaken. He is a threat to the great silence we have worked so long to maintain. A soldier entered the room and handed the proctor a tablet. He looked at the screen. We have them, he said. The labyrinth's energy signature stabilized on the surface 20 minutes ago. The signal is weak, but it originates from a small hotel in the Tsilian Hill district. My team is moving into position now. Back in the hotel room, Arthur and Eliza were poring over the map, their heads close together. They felt a deceptive sense of safety, the anonymous room a temporary shield against the world. But Arthur's connection to the labyrinth, his unnatural state of being, had subtly honed his senses. He caught it first, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound from the hallway, almost too quiet to be heard. It was the sound of a fiber-optic camera being fed under their door. He looked up, his eyes locking with Eliza's, his expression a mask of sudden, cold urgency. He didn't need to say a word. She understood. They had been found. There was no time for the labyrinth's impossible door. He grabbed the satchel containing the sphere. Eliza threw open the room's single window, which led to a narrow, rusted fire escape overlooking a dark alley. They scrambled out onto the rickety platform just as they heard the quiet, professional thump of their hotel room door being breached by a battering ram. They didn't look back. They clambered down the fire escape, their feet hitting the grimy cobblestones of the alley with a jolt. From the street, they could hear the squeal of tires as vehicles converged on their location. They were on the run again, fugitives in the Eternal City, with the full, ancient weight of the Viridian Order just steps behind them. The rusted metal of the fire escape groaned under their combined weight as Arthur and Eliza hit the cobblestones of the alley. Behind and above them, the splintered crash of their hotel room door being forced open was followed by sharp, muffled commands in a language they didn't understand. There was no time to think, only to run. Arthur, propelled by a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in decades, took the lead. He plunged into the labyrinthine tangle of Roman streets, pulling Eliza along with him. They were not warriors or spies. They were a watchmaker and a scholar, and their flight was one of desperate, clever improvisation. They rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a dinner party seated at an outdoor cafe. With murmured apologies, they pushed through, the disruption creating a momentary chaos of angry shouts and clattering cutlery that hopefully cost their pursuers a precious few seconds. They could hear the disciplined, heavy footfalls of tactical boots on the cobblestones behind them. The Viridian Order was closing in. Seeing a brightly lit, bustling piazza ahead, Arthur made a split-second decision. Instead of avoiding the crowd, he dove directly into it. For a few frantic moments, they were swallowed by the river of evening tourists and locals, a chaotic sea of faces, languages, and flashing cameras. They pushed through the throng, keeping their heads down, and emerged on the far side of the square, where a tram was clattering to a halt, its bell ringing. Without a second thought, they leaped aboard just as its doors slid shut, leaving their hunters stranded on the other side of the moving vehicle. Through the glass, they saw two of the dark-clad figures emerge from the crowd, their faceless helmets scanning the tram in frustration as it pulled away, carrying their quarry into the Roman night. They had escaped, but it was a temporary reprieve, not a victory. They rode the tram for several miles, a long, silent journey through the illuminated heart of the city, before getting off in a quiet, residential neighborhood far from the tourist centers. They found sanctuary in the hushed, candlelit nave of a small, ancient church that was still open for evening prayers. Sinking into a wooden pew in the back, the scent of old stone and incense a calming balm, the reality of their situation finally crashed down upon them. "They found us so fast," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling, the scholar's confidence replaced by the raw fear of a fugitive. "That energy signature you mentioned, the labyrinth is a beacon. As long as we have it, they can track us." Arthur looked down at the simple leather satchel at his feet, the source of his salvation and now the cause of their peril. "It is also our map, our key, and our compass," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't abandon it. We just have to move faster than they can." Their strategy had to change. Careful, methodical research was a luxury they could no longer afford. They were no longer academics on a field trip. They were fugitives in a high-stakes race. They had to get to Vesuvius, and they had to do it immediately, before the Order could anticipate their destination and set a wider trap. Leaving the sanctuary of the church, they found a dimly lit side street where a man was leaning against a slightly battered sedan, a handwritten auto and allegio, car for rent, sign propped in the window. It was the kind of unofficial, cash-only business that thrives in the gray areas of any major city. It was risky, but it was untraceable. After a tense negotiation in broken Italian and universal hand gestures, Arthur handed over a thick wad of euros. A few minutes later, they were heading south out of Rome, the city's ancient glow fading in their rearview mirror. The drive south was a long, paranoid vigil. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind them was a potential threat. Every police car they passed caused their hearts to seize. Arthur drove with a steady, focused calm, while Eliza kept watch, their conversation sparse and tense. As they drew closer to Naples, the landscape changed. The rolling hills of Lazio gave way to the fertile plains of Campania, and soon, a new shape began to dominate the eastern horizon. It was a dark, massive silhouette against the star-dusted sky, a sleeping giant whose very presence seemed to suck the light from the air around it. Vesuvius. They bypassed the chaotic sprawl of Naples, navigating instead towards the smaller, quieter towns that huddled at the volcano's base. They drove through the streets of Herculaneum, a modern town built directly on top of the ancient one that lay perfectly preserved in volcanic ash below. The weight of history here was not majestic like in Rome, it was tragic and violent. It was in a deserted parking lot overlooking the sea, with the dark mass of the volcano looming over them, that the labyrinth began to stir. Arthur, who had placed the satchel on the seat between them, felt a distinct, low-frequency vibration. It wasn't a warning, but a pull, a hum of proximity. He took the sphere out. It was glowing with a soft, internal light. The hum grew stronger as he turned in a slow circle. It was quietest when he faced the sea, and loudest when he faced not the main tourist-trodden peak of the volcano, but a dark, undeveloped flank to the north, an area marked on their map as a series of old, abandoned quarries and restricted geological sites. The labyrinth was no longer just showing them a map. It was a dowsing rod, a proximity detector, pulling them towards the immense, sleeping power of the compass of gravity. They stood in the cool night air, the distant lights of the bay twinkling below, the silent, menacing volcano before them. The hunt in Prague had been a puzzle of the mind. The chase in Rome had been a trial of instinct. This, Arthur knew, would be a challenge of courage, a journey into the heart of a power that could awaken at any moment. The labyrinth hummed in his hands, a steady, insistent guide, leading them away from the world of men and towards a hidden path into the mountain's fiery heart. The Chronos labyrinth hummed in Arthur's hands, a living compass pulling them away from the sleeping towns and towards the dark, silent mass of the volcano. Their path was not a tourist trail marked by signs and handrails, but a rugged, treacherous scramble up the mountain's flank. They moved through the darkness, the loose volcanic soil and sharp-edged scree shifting and sliding under their feet with every step. The silence was absolute, a profound and ancient quiet broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crunching of their own footsteps. Above them, the sky was a black velvet canvas, strewn with the brilliant, cold diamonds of a billion stars. The labyrinth's vibrations grew stronger, its soft light a comforting guide in the oppressive dark. It led them to a high, chain-link fence, strung with faded red and white signs bearing a single, stark word: Pericolo. Danger. Beyond it lay a ghostly landscape of sheer, man-made cliffs and the skeletal silhouettes of abandoned quarrying equipment, all slowly being reclaimed by the tenacious, twisted vegetation that thrived in the fertile volcanic soil. This was the restricted zone. The gate was secured with a heavy, modern padlock. Eliza looked at it with dismay, but Arthur simply knelt and unzipped a small compartment in his satchel, retrieving a compact, high-quality multi-tool. To him, any lock was just a less elegant type of clockwork. He worked for less than a minute, his impossibly steady hands manipulating the tool with practiced grace. With a soft, metallic snick, the lock sprang open. They slipped through the gate, entering the desolate quarry. The labyrinth's pull was almost overwhelming now, a physical tug that led them past the rusting hulks of machinery to the far back wall of the man-made canyon. There, partially obscured by a recent rockfall and a curtain of hardy vines, was a dark, narrow opening, a natural fissure in the mountain's rock face, a jagged wound leading into the darkness. "This is it," Eliza breathed, her voice a hushed echo in the quarry. A new kind of cold, primal and ancient, seemed to flow from the cave mouth. They paused at the threshold, the world of wind and stars behind them, a world of unknown, subterranean darkness before them. With a shared, determined nod, they stepped inside. The labyrinth's light brightened as they entered, casting their long, dancing shadows against the tunnel walls. The passage sloped steeply downwards, leading them deep into the heart of the volcano. The air grew noticeably warmer, and carried a faint but sharp, acrid scent of sulfur. A low-frequency vibration became apparent, not a sound they could hear, but a deep, resonant thrum they could feel through the soles of their shoes, the slumbering, tectonic power of the magma chamber miles below. After a descent that felt like miles, the narrow tunnel opened dramatically into a vast, breathtaking cavern. This was not a man-made chamber like the one beneath Rome. It was a cathedral of nature, a geologic miracle. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. The walls were not bare rock, but were lined with colossal, shimmering crystals, some as thick as a man's body. They caught the labyrinth's white light and refracted it into a million splintered rainbows, painting the darkness with ethereal, shifting colors. In the exact center of this crystal sanctuary was a perfectly circular, perfectly placid pool of a substance that shone like liquid mercury. And floating, suspended by no visible means, about a foot above the pool's mirror-like surface, was the compass of gravity. It was larger and more terrifyingly beautiful than they could have imagined. It was an armillary sphere, nearly 6 feet in diameter, composed of interlocking rings of a polished, jet-black material that seemed to absorb the light. At its very heart, where the Earth would be in a model of the solar system, was a jagged, pulsating shard of what looked like solidified lightning, a captive thunderbolt that emitted a soft, hypnotic, violet glow. It was an object of immense, alien power, humming with a force that made the air around it seem to warp and bend. Slowly, reverently, they began to walk towards it. They took one step, then another. On the third step, they were stopped dead, as if they had walked into an invisible, solid wall. It was an immense, crushing pressure, pushing down on them from all sides. Arthur felt his knees buckle, the weight on his shoulders suddenly immense. Breathing became a conscious, difficult effort. He looked at Eliza and saw she was struggling too, her face pale, her hands braced against the unseen force. "Gravitational field," she gasped, her voice strained. It's warping space around itself. The closer we get, the stronger the pull becomes. It's not a barrier. It's the law of physics." They had found the third instrument, but it was protected by the most fundamental force in the universe. They were standing at the edge of a gravitational well, a cosmic trap from which there could be no escape. The riddle in Prague had required wit. This puzzle required something else entirely. How could two mortals, armed with only their courage and a sphere of intricate clockwork, hope to overcome the very fabric of space-time? The invisible wall of force was absolute. Arthur and Eliza struggled against it, every inch of their bodies screaming under the immense, crushing pressure. It felt as if the weight of the mountain itself had been placed upon their shoulders. Breathing was a laborious task, their hearts hammering in their chests not from exertion, but from the sheer physical strain of existing within the powerful gravitational field. After a few agonizing seconds, they were forced to retreat, stumbling back until the pressure subsided to a manageable, though still deeply uncomfortable, level. "We can't fight it," Eliza gasped, leaning against a large crystal for support, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "It's not a barrier, it's a gradient. The force must increase exponentially the closer we get to the center. It's like trying to push your way to the surface of a star. Brute force is useless." Her scientific assessment confirmed what Arthur felt in his bones. This was not a lock to be picked or a riddle to be solved with words. This was a law of nature, weaponized and perfected into the ultimate defense. But as a man who had spent a lifetime with intricate systems, Arthur knew that no system of power is ever truly constant. There is always a cycle, a rhythm, a moment of release. His eyes scanned the chamber, looking for the flaw in the design. He observed the compass itself, its dark rings motionless, but the violet shard of lightning at its core pulsed with a slow, steady, hypnotic rhythm, a cosmic heartbeat. Then his gaze fell upon the pool below it. The surface was a perfect, unbroken mirror of liquid metal. That was wrong. An object of such immense gravity should have been pulling the liquid into a deep vortex, a whirlpool in the center. But it was preternaturally still. "The stillness," Arthur said aloud, his mind latching onto the inconsistency. "Why is the pool so still?" Eliza looked from the pool to the pulsing core of the compass. "Gravitational waves," she said, a torrent of theoretical physics flooding her mind. "It's not emitting a constant field. It's pulsing with the core. The waves are the source of the pressure. But between each wave, for a microsecond, there must be a null point. A moment of absolute zero gravity." Arthur seized on the idea, translating it into his own mechanical language. "The escapement," he breathed. "Every clock's balance wheel is driven by a cycle of impulse and stillness. The power is released in ticks, not a continuous flow. This entire cavern is a kind of clockwork." The puzzle was beginning to reveal itself. They didn't need to fight the wave, they needed to step through the stillness between the beats. But the rhythm was impossibly fast, the null points too brief for human reflexes to ever catch. They needed a perfect timer. And then Arthur looked down at the Chronos labyrinth in his hands. Its gentle, white light was pulsing. And it was pulsing in perfect, absolute synchronicity with the violet heartbeat of the compass of gravity. It had been attuned to the rhythm of the cavern from the moment they entered. It was the key, not to unlock the defense, but to navigate it. "I have to go," Arthur said, his voice quiet with resolve. "The labyrinth, it can feel the rhythm. I think it can guide me." "Arthur, no," Eliza protested, her eyes wide with fear. "If your timing is off by even a fraction of a second, the gravity will crush you." "I have faced worse," he said simply, his mind flashing back to the man in the charcoal suit. This was just another system, another set of rules to be outsmarted. He handed her the satchel and his small multi-tool. "If I don't come back, take this and find a way out. The labyrinth is the key to everything. Don't let the order get it." Before she could argue further, he turned to face the compass. He held the labyrinth in both hands, its steady pulse of light a comforting guide. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and attuned his senses not just to the light, but to the deep, thrumming beat that now seemed to resonate within his own chest. He took his first step. As the labyrinth pulsed, he moved his foot forward. For a single, breathtaking instant, he felt utterly weightless, as if stepping into a vacuum. Then, the crushing gravity slammed back down, rooting his foot to the stone floor. He was inside the field. The pressure was immense, but he was standing. He waited, his muscles screaming in protest, his entire body trembling with the strain. The labyrinth pulsed again. He took another weightless step. From Eliza's perspective, it was a horrifying, heroic ballet. She watched Arthur lurch across the cavern floor in a series of slow, agonizingly deliberate movements. He would be frozen in place for several seconds, his body rigid with effort, and then he would suddenly glide forward a single step before freezing again. He was walking on the impossibly brief moments of stillness in a storm of gravitational fury. Step by agonizing step, he crossed the cavern. The air grew thick and heavy, and the violet light of the compass seemed to grow, bathing him in its alien glow. Finally, after a journey of only 50 feet that had taken an eternity, he stood at the very edge of the mercurial pool. The power here was unimaginable, yet by moving with the cavern's rhythm, he stood in the eye of the hurricane, a still point in a turning world. The compass of gravity floated before him, its dark rings seeming to twist the space around them. The pulsating shard at its core felt like a living heart. He had done it. He had breached the ultimate defense. Slowly, his movements still timed to the labyrinth's pulse, he raised his hand. He reached out across the mirror-like surface of the pool, his fingers extended towards the cold, obsidian-like ring of the ancient, powerful artifact. He was about to touch it, to claim the third instrument. Time seemed to slow as Arthur's fingers, steady and certain, made contact with the cold, smooth surface of the compass of gravity. The moment he touched it, the universe flooded his senses. It was not a physical shock, but a flash of pure, undiluted information. For a breathtaking instant, he felt the relentless pull of the moon on the Earth's oceans, the crushing weight of miles of water in the deepest trenches, the slow, grinding agony of tectonic plates shifting beneath continents, and the silent, dizzying spin of the galaxy itself. He felt the universe not as a collection of objects, but as a web of interconnected forces, and this compass was one of the needles that held the threads. It was a sensory overload that would have shattered a normal mind, but Arthur, a man already unstuck from the natural order, held on. The compass, in turn, seemed to recognize him. Or rather, it recognized the labyrinth he held. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between the two artifacts. The crushing gravitational field that had pinned them down for so long did not fade, it vanished. It collapsed in on itself, retreating back into the heart of the compass as if it had never been. The pressure in the cavern vanished. Eliza cried out in relief as she was suddenly able to breathe freely, to move without fighting the weight of a world on her shoulders. She rushed forward as Arthur, with a final, rhythmic step, stood directly before the artifact. He wrapped his hands around the large, obsidian-like sphere. It looked as if it should weigh a ton, but as he lifted it from its invisible perch above the mercurial pool, he found it was shockingly, unnervingly light. It weighed almost nothing, as if it were a perfect equilibrium point, a place where gravity had ceased to have meaning. He turned and carried it back across the cavern floor, its violet heart pulsing gently in his arms. Eliza met him halfway, her face a mixture of terror, relief, and utter awe. "Arthur, you did it." "We did it," he corrected, his voice strained from the lingering phantom pressure. They now possessed 3 of the instruments. 3 pieces of a puzzle so vast they were only just beginning to comprehend its shape. But their victory came with an immediate and unforeseen consequence. As Arthur stood holding both the labyrinth and the compass, a powerful synergy erupted between them. The labyrinth in his left hand flared with a brilliant white light. Unbidden, the holographic map of the world shimmered into existence, floating in the crystal-lit air of the cavern. But the map had changed. The nodes representing Providence, Prague, and their current location inside Vesuvius were no longer just points of light. They were blazing suns, and they were now connected by thick, radiant bands of energy. A new, global circuit had been forged. And the other nodes on the map, the dormant sites in the Andes, in the deep Himalayas, under the Egyptian sands, were no longer quiet. They had begun to pulse with faint, sympathetic light, stirred from their ancient slumber. "The resonance cascade," Eliza whispered, the proctor's warning echoing in her memory. "Arthur, we're not just finding them. We're activating the whole network." Miles away, in a sleek mobile command center hastily established in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, the Viridian Order saw it too. Alarms blared, and red lights flashed on a bank of monitors. "Sir," a technician shouted over the noise. "Massive, synchronized energy surge. The Prague and Vesuvius nexuses are locked in a feedback loop. We're detecting resonance spikes from every known dormant site. The cascade has begun." The proctor stood before a large screen displaying the same chaotic, flaring map. His face was a mask of grim resolve. "He is a fool," he said, his voice a low growl. "He thinks he is gathering knowledge, but he is lighting a global fuse. The great silence has been broken." This was no longer a simple recovery mission. It was now a race to prevent a global catastrophe. "He will follow the path of least resistance," the proctor declared. "The cascade will energize the next most volatile nexus point." He pointed to a brightly flaring node on the map of North Africa. "The Nile, the sunken ossuary of 100 kings. He will go there next. Redeploy every asset in the Mediterranean. I want that site sealed before he even sets foot on the continent." Back in the cavern, Arthur and Eliza stared at the activated map, a dawning horror on their faces. They had intended to be careful, discreet scholars. Instead, they had become catalysts for an event of global significance, the consequences of which they could not predict. But they could not stop. To stop now, to leave the instruments scattered and half awake, would be to invite disaster. The only path was forward. As if agreeing with this silent conclusion, the compass of gravity in Arthur's arms pulsed with violet light. A thin, laser-like line of violet energy shot out from the holographic map, pointing with unerring accuracy to the flashing node in Egypt. It was a command, a directive, showing them their next destination. At the same instant, however, the Chronos labyrinth reacted in a way it never had before. A new symbol on its surface, a design that looked like a sphere cracking apart, began to glow not with white, gold, or blue light, but with a deep, menacing, blood red. It was a clear, unambiguous warning. They stood frozen in the heart of the volcano, caught between two powerful, conflicting signals. The compass of gravity, the instrument of cosmic force, was urging them onward to Egypt. But the Chronos labyrinth, Arthur's own creation, his savior and constant guide, was screaming a silent, desperate warning of a terrible danger that lay on that very path. Their greatest victory had just presented them with their most dangerous dilemma yet. The cavern was filled with a silent, escalating war of signals. From the compass of gravity, a brilliant violet line of light sliced through the holographic map, a clear, imperial command: go here, go next. But from the Chronos labyrinth, the blood-red glow of the new symbol, the fractured sphere, pulsed with an urgent, primal warning: danger, peril, folly. Arthur stood at the nexus of the two opposing forces, a conduit for a cosmic argument he could barely comprehend. "We can't ignore this," Eliza said, her voice a tense whisper. She pointed to the labyrinth, her scholarly calm completely gone, replaced by a deep, instinctual fear. "The labyrinth has been our guide, our protector. It warned me when you were in danger with the gravity field. It has never been wrong. A warning this strong. Arthur, something is different about the site in Egypt. Something is terribly wrong." Heeding her words, Arthur focused on the warning. The labyrinth was his own creation, an extension of his own mind and soul. Its warning felt deeply personal, a father's desperate plea to a child walking towards a cliff edge. But the pull from the compass was undeniable, a magnetic, gravitational tug on his very being. Having bonded with the instruments, he was now part of their network, and the network was demanding the completion of its circuit. "What do your texts say?" Arthur asked, forcing himself to think methodically. "The sunken ossuary of 100 kings. What was its purpose?" Eliza frantically searched her memory, her mind racing through the fragmented legends she had spent years studying. "The lore around it is different," she said, thinking aloud. "The other sites are described with words like creation, harmony, balance. The Egyptian site is always mentioned with words of fear. Containment. Silence. The great binding. The legends don't describe the instrument there as a tool to be used, but as a lock on a cage." A terrifying hypothesis began to form. What if the instrument in Egypt isn't an object like these? She posited, her eyes wide. What if it's a prison? And the cascade we've started, the energy flowing through the network, it's not just waking up an artifact. It's rattling the bars of the cage. The image was horrifying. They were not just on a quest to find a set of miraculous tools. They might be on the verge of unleashing an ancient, imprisoned entity. The labyrinth's warning, the symbol of a fractured sphere, suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It was warning of a broken world, a broken reality, should the prison fail. They stood in the heart of the volcano, the weight of their decision pressing down on them more than the gravity ever had. To heed the warning meant abandoning the path, allowing the cascade to continue unchecked, potentially weakening the ancient prison from a distance. To ignore it meant walking knowingly into a trap of cosmic proportions. It was Arthur who made the choice. His entire impossible journey had begun when he chose to face an insurmountable force rather than accept his fate. He could not stop now. "The cascade has already started," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "We lit the fuse. We can't walk away and hope it goes out. If there is a prison, and its lock is weakening, then we have to be there to see it doesn't break open." He looked at Eliza, his eyes clear and resolved. "The labyrinth isn't telling us to run, Eliza. It's telling us what we will be facing. It's telling us to be ready." Their path was set. They had to get out of the mountain and out of Italy before the Viridian Order could seal the country. Their first logistical challenge was the compass of gravity. It was 6 feet across, impossible to conceal. Arthur, holding the almost weightless object, focused his will upon it. He didn't think of it as a machine, but as a concept. Be small. Be hidden. The compass responded. The dark, obsidian-like rings did not shrink. They seemed to fold in on themselves, twisting through dimensions Arthur couldn't see. The vast sphere compacted into a dense, black, and perfectly featureless orb about the size of a bowling ball. It was still heavy with an unnatural gravitational pull, but it was now small enough to fit inside a large, reinforced duffel bag. They made their ascent, emerging from the quarry into the pre-dawn twilight. They abandoned the rental car and made their way to the gritty, industrial port of Naples. There, in the world of cash transactions and no questions asked, Arthur chartered a passage on a rusty but seaworthy fishing trawler bound for Alexandria, Egypt. As the small boat chugged its way out of the bay and into the vast, dark expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, Arthur and Eliza stood on the deck, the lights of Italy shrinking behind them. The journey was a much-needed respite, a quiet interval of rocking waves and salt spray between the frantic chase in Rome and the unknown danger that awaited them in Egypt. They were partners now in the truest sense, bound by a secret that could shatter the world. The fear was still there, a cold knot in their stomachs, but it was overshadowed by a resolute sense of duty. Arthur pulled the labyrinth from his satchel. In the darkness of the open sea, its warning light seemed to burn even brighter. The blood-red glow of the fractured sphere painted his aged, determined face, a constant, silent reminder of the stakes. They were sailing towards the greatest danger they had ever known, guided by a warning and a will, two fugitives carrying the fate of the world in their luggage. At dawn, they would see the coast of Africa. The fishing trawler chugged into the sprawling, chaotic port of Alexandria as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold. The transition was jarring. They left the cool, dark solitude of the Mediterranean night and entered a world of intense light, heat, and noise. The air, thick with the sense of salt, diesel, spices, and desert dust, was a living thing. The sounds of the awakening city, the calls to prayer, the shouts of dockworkers, the incessant honking of horns, formed a vibrant, overwhelming chorus. Arthur and Eliza disembarked, offering a quiet, grateful nod to the grizzled captain who had asked no questions. They pulled up the hoods of their jackets, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible as they melted into the throng of the morning commute. But their sense of anonymity was shattered almost immediately. As they navigated a crowded market street, a sleek, black sedan with diplomatic plates slid past them, moving with an unnerving authority through the chaotic traffic. In the passenger seat, Eliza caught a glimpse of a severe-looking woman with a communications earpiece, her eyes methodically scanning the faces in the crowd. A block later, they saw two men, dressed like European businessmen but moving with the disciplined posture of soldiers, observing the entrance to the city's main train station. The Viridian Order was not just coming, they were already here. They had anticipated their destination and had already begun to seal the city. There was no time to rest, no time to plan. They were back in the race, and they were already behind. The sunken ossuary of 100 kings, Eliza said, her voice low and tense as they ducked into a quiet alley. The legends place it beneath the lost waters of the Salt Lake. That has to be Lake Mariotis, south of the city. We have to get there now. Public transport was too risky. They found what they were looking for in the city's sprawling western suburbs, an old battered pickup truck for sale, its owner a farmer more interested in the wad of cash Arthur offered than in the proper paperwork. Half an hour later, they were rattling south, leaving the city behind, the vast, shimmering expanse of the Salt Lake appearing on their left. Guided by the insistent pull from the compass and the duffel bag between them, they left the paved road, bumping along a dusty track that led them to a desolate, wind-swept stretch of the lakeshore. The area was dotted with the crumbling, half-submerged ruins of an ancient settlement, forgotten by time. It was here, in this place of endings, that the pull was strongest. The labyrinth in Arthur's satchel was now pulsing with its blood-red warning, a frantic, silent scream. The entrance, according to the compass's focused energy, was out in the lake itself, 100 feet from the shore, in a spot marked only by a cluster of collapsing stone pillars that jutted from the brackish water. It's submerged, Eliza stated, a note of despair in her voice. How are we supposed to get in? Arthur looked from the sunken ruins to the black, featureless orb of the compacted compass of gravity. He was beginning to understand that the instruments were not just tools, but extensions of his own will. He lifted the heavy orb from the bag. Focusing all his intent on the water before them, he didn't ask, he commanded. Move. Open a path. The compass responded. The air grew heavy, the pressure dropping. The surface of the lake before them began to tremble. The water did not part like in a myth. It was pulled, violently, downwards. A swirling, roaring vortex formed, sucking the water into a deep, churning whirlpool. At the center of the vortex, the lake bed was exposed, a circle of wet, dark mud and, in its heart, a square granite entryway with a set of stone stairs leading down into blackness. It was a terrifying, magnificent sight, a raw display of power that left them breathless. Not waiting for the unstable passage to collapse, they scrambled down the muddy bank and into the exposed entrance, plunging into the darkness just as the vortex began to falter and the waters of the lake began to surge back in with a deafening roar. They were in. The air was deathly still and smelled of stagnant water, decay, and something else, an ancient, profound wrongness. This was not a workshop or a sanctuary. It was a tomb. The walls of the descending staircase were lined with thousands of niches, each one holding a human skull, their empty eye sockets watching the intruder's descent. The labyrinth's red light pulsed frantically, painting the macabre scene in a hellish, crimson glow. They followed the stairs down into the heart of the ossuary, emerging into a vast, circular chamber. The architecture was a nightmarish fusion of dynastic Egyptian and the architect's impossible geometry. In the center of the chamber, there was no instrument. Instead, a colossal, featureless sarcophagus made of a black, light-devouring stone rested on a dais. It was bound by shimmering chains that were not forged of metal, but woven from pure, solidified light. Many of the chains were glowing with a steady, powerful hum, but others, strained by the resonance cascade they had unleashed, were flickering violently, threatening to break. Standing before the sarcophagus, his back to them, was a tall, familiar figure in a long, dark coat. The proctor. He turned slowly, and his face was not one of anger or triumph, but of grim, weary pity. He was alone. "So you have arrived," the proctor said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that echoed in the deathly quiet chamber. "The clockmaker and the scholar. You have done well. You have followed the trail of breadcrumbs perfectly." Arthur and Eliza froze, confusion warring with their fear. "You believe you are on a quest for knowledge," the proctor continued, his eyes boring into Arthur's. "But you have never once stopped to ask who laid the path for you. You have been gathering the keys. And you have brought the master key," his gaze flicked to the labyrinth in Arthur's hand, "to the lock." He gestured to the great, chained sarcophagus. "This is not an instrument. This is a prison. And the prisoner within has been whispering to your labyrinth, guiding its intuition, pulling you here since the moment you first woke it. You have not been on a quest." The proctor's voice dropped, filled with a terrible gravity. "You have been on a rescue mission." The proctor's words fell into the dead air of the ossuary, each one a hammer blow shattering the entire foundation of Arthur and Eliza's quest. Manipulated, guided, lured. They were not pioneers on a journey of discovery. They were pawns in a cosmic endgame that had been set in motion long before they were born. Arthur looked down at the Chronos labyrinth in his hand. The blood-red warning light still pulsed, but he now understood it with a terrible, new clarity. It was not a warning about a place. It was the machine's own true consciousness, a desperate, fading cry for help against the ancient will that had hijacked it, that had twisted its purpose from a map of time into a key for a prison. He felt a profound, soul-deep betrayal, not by a friend, but by the very logic and curiosity that had driven him his entire life. "Who is in there?" Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the colossal, chained sarcophagus. "We do not know its name," the proctor said, his gaze never leaving the prison. "The architect's texts refer to it only as the Great Dissonance. It is not a being of flesh and blood. It is an entity of anti-creation. Where the universe strives for harmony, order, and complexity, it offers only silence, entropy, and the void. It does not wish to rule the world. It wishes to unmake it." He explained that the Viridian Order were the descendants of the architect's own apprentices, tasked with a single, sacred duty, to be the eternal jailers. They had kept the instruments separate and dormant, for together, they formed the one and only key. "The resonance machine weakens the harmonic chains of light," he said, his voice a grim lecture. "The compass of gravity disrupts the physical laws that bind the prison to a single location. And the labyrinth. The labyrinth is the master key, designed to manipulate time itself to find the final, precise moment to turn the lock." As he spoke, the very air in the chamber grew colder, heavier. A deep, discordant hum, the sound of a breaking chord, began to emanate from the sarcophagus. The resonance cascade, amplified by the proximity of the three united instruments, was reaching its terrifying crescendo. One by one, the flickering chains of light began to snap with a sound like shattering glass. A palpable wave of utter despair washed over them, a psychic assault that promised utter meaninglessness. The labyrinth in Arthur's hand began to glow with a blinding, ferocious white light, its internal mechanism spinning at an impossible speed. It was being forced, against its own will, to complete the final sequence. "It is too late," the proctor breathed, a note of defeat in his voice. "The prisoner has the key. The lock is turning." But the proctor didn't understand. Arthur Pendleton was not just the key's carrier. He was its creator. He was the watchmaker. And no one understood the inner workings of his own masterpiece better than he. In that final, critical moment, Arthur saw the entire system for what it was. A vast, cosmic clockwork mechanism. A prison was a lock. And a lock, however grand, could be mended. He had to make a choice. A choice he had been unknowingly prepared for his entire life. He had spent decades mending broken time. Now, he had to mend a broken eternity. He looked at Eliza, and for a fleeting instant, a gentle paternal smile touched his lips. "Every system has a loophole," he said softly. He turned and walked forward, stepping through the psychic gale of despair as if it were a mere curtain. He did not fight the labyrinth's forced activation. He yielded to it, embracing it, and poured his own will, his own consciousness, his own essence into the raging storm of energy within the sphere. He reached the sarcophagus just as the last chain of light shattered. The great stone lid began to grind open, and a tide of pure, silent, unmaking void began to pour out, extinguishing the light and sound around it. Arthur pressed the glowing labyrinth firmly against the sarcophagus's black stone. He spoke to his creation, a final command from a master to his life's work. "Time can be a prison," he whispered. "Let us build a better one." This was his gambit. He would not just relock the cage. He would become part of the lock. He pushed his life, his memories, his hard 100 years, and the very soul of a man who loved order and function, into the mechanism. The labyrinth's brilliant white light shifted, deepening into a steady, resolute, and indescribably beautiful gold. New chains, woven not of ancient magic but of pure, ordered, intricate time itself, erupted from the labyrinth. They were patterns of clockwork, of interlocking gears and spinning balance wheels, all rendered in golden light. They wrapped themselves around the sarcophagus, pulling the lid shut with a deafening, final boom that was the sound of a perfect, universal chord. The tide of darkness was sucked back inside, its silence vanquished by the triumphant, harmonious chime. The price of this victory was Arthur himself. As the final chain locked into place, his physical form dissolved into a swirling cascade of golden light, which was then drawn into the labyrinth. He had become the final, critical gear in his own machine, a permanent, conscious will reinforcing the prison for all time. He had outsmarted death with his cleverness. He defeated the great dissonance with his sacrifice. The Chronos labyrinth, its purpose fulfilled and its master now a part of it, fell from its place on the sarcophagus and clattered to the stone floor. Its light was gone. It was a cold, inert sphere of metal. Silence descended upon the ossuary. The sarcophagus was sealed, stronger than it had ever been. The proctor stood in stunned, humbled silence, having witnessed an act of will and sacrifice his order's rigid dogma had never conceived of. Eliza walked forward and knelt, her hands trembling as she picked up the cold, silent labyrinth. Her quest for knowledge was over. Arthur, her friend and mentor, was gone. She was alone, the last inheritor of an impossible legacy. The proctor finally looked at her, his enemy, his savior. "The great silence is restored," he said, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "The Viridian Order will remain its guardians. But he was its master." Eliza clutched the inert sphere to her chest. She was no longer just a scholar. She was a witness, a storyteller. Her new duty was not to uncover the past, but to ensure that the future would never forget the watchmaker from Providence, the man who had faced down death, and in the end, had chosen to mend the world by giving it all of his time.